Chapter 183. Dozens of Griffin Knights, including Bob Asher and Great Swordmaster Gabriel, were present. Little Dark Dragon Gilbert would be courting death if he were to face such a formidable force head-on. Gilbert was quite tactful under Han Shoror's urging. He didn't say a word as he charged out of the hole in the wall. The archers and spearmen who had regained their footing in Gabriel's direction suddenly fired in unison, filling the air with arrows and spears as they flew towards Gilbert. Han Shoror and the others had long since made their preparations. Emily released her dark magic, forming an oval-shaped magic shield in the sky. Han Shoror also chanted the dark mist magic, covering a large area in darkness. Candace, Phoebe, and Caspian all used all sorts of techniques to cut down the arrows that pierced their way. Han Shoror had already suffered some injuries from his previous exchange with Gabriel. It was a good thing that Han Shoror could also use necromancy magic in addition to his magical yuan. As Han Shoror chanted the incantation, several zombie warriors and 2 hate warriors suddenly appeared on the ground, as well as dozens of skeletal warriors, forcibly blocking the hole in the wall that Gilbert had blasted open. These summoned dark creatures acted as meat shields, blocking the hole in the wall and causing many attacks to land on them. Add to that the effects of Emily's magic shield, Han Shoror's dark mist, and Phoebe, Candace, and Caspian's assistance, Gilbert's enormous body wasn't harmed in the slightest. The dark creatures that Han Shoror had summoned were covered in arrows and spears. When the Griffin Legion soldiers drew near, Han Shoror once again chanted the corpse explosion spell that he'd just learned, causing the flesh and blood of 2 hate warriors to fly through the air. The dozen or so soldiers on the side were caught off guard and all fell to the ground. Take to the skies and leave this place as quickly as possible. Taking advantage of the fact that the dark creatures were still blocking the wall and the archers and spearmen were temporarily unable to display their might, Han Shoror abruptly yelled. Gilbert didn't hesitate after hearing Han Shoror's call. His enormous body whipped its tail and 2 houses on the side collapsed, sending boulders flying and trees snapping. Gilbert then yelled loudly for a while as his enormous body, which had been only a few meters above the ground, suddenly shot towards the dark sky. "Stop right there." Bob Asher, who was on the back of the Griffin, had miraculously charged over at this moment. The silver spear in his hand suddenly shot out like a silver meteor, its tail trailing a brilliant afterglow as it shot towards Gilbert's back. As a sky rider, Bob Asher had been through hundreds of battles over the years and had seen all sorts of situations. Not only was his own strength ferocious, but his battle experience was also incomparably rich. He knew that it wouldn't be easy to catch up to Gilbert with the Griffin's speed. The only way was to injure Gilbert first. Otherwise, even with a large group of Griffin riders behind him, it would be impossible to keep Han Shoror and the others here. This spear had been condensed with Bob Asher's surging fighting aura and was dazzlingly dazzling in the pitch-black night sky. The sharp aura it contained brought enormous pressure to Han Shoror and the others. The spear whistled sharply as it flew over, seeming to borrow the force of the wind. Han Shoror quickly chanted another bone spear incantation, and 2 bone spears abruptly landed on the incoming silver spear according to Han Shoror's will. Just as the 2 bone spears flew towards the silver spear, 2 crisp pa-pa sounds were heard before they shattered. The silver spear's momentum was not hindered at all, and it continued to shoot straight towards him. Just as Han Shoror was startled, Emily chanted a dark magic spell and the Grim Reaper's scythe once again blossomed in the air. As Emily waved the staff in her hand downwards, the Grim Reaper's scythe formed from dark magic swiftly chopped at the silver spear that continued to shoot towards them. Another burst of popping sounds rang out as Emily's slender figure on Gilbert's body suddenly staggered and involuntarily took a few steps back. The Grim Reaper's scythe formed from her mental strength also turned to dust in the blink of an eye, just like the 2 bone spears Han Shoror had just shot out. But because of Emily's Grim Reaper's scythe, much of the fighting aura on the silver spear had dissipated. Whether it was the dazzling silver light it emitted or the speed at which it attacked, all of it had suddenly decreased. Han Shoror's heart ached at this moment, but he didn't have the time to comfort Emily. His 2 eyes focused unblinkingly on the spear, ready to summon the Demon Slayer edge at any moment. 2 crossbow bolts suddenly shot out from Phoebe and Candace's hands. Candace's bolt missed, but Phoebe's directly collided with the silver spear that had been weakened. Because of this crossbow bolt, the speed of the spear was once again reduced. Gilbert's speed had increased by this time, and he'd already flown into the horizon in the blink of an eye. He'd left Bob Asher behind on his griffin, and the distance between the two was still gradually increasing. Pass down my orders. The entire city is on lockdown. No one is allowed to enter, but not leave. Shut down all the transportation matrices that lead to other cities. No one is allowed to activate them without my orders, or they'll be killed without question. Bob Asher's wild roars traveled far and wide, and even Han Shoror and the others could hear them clearly. Are you all right? Han Shoror's body relaxed when he saw that he was temporarily out of danger, but his expression tightened as he rushed to Emily's side, supporting Emily and asking urgently. Emily tore off the mask on her face, and her face was a bit pale, but her heart was filled with sweetness when she saw Han Shoror's sincere concern for her. She laughed lightly and said a bit weakly, I'm fine, I've just overused my magic. Don't worry, how are you? I'm fine as well, I'll recover after a few days of rest. Han Shoror also smiled and comforted Emily. On the other side, Phoebe's expression was a bit uncomfortable when she saw Han Shoror and Emily's intimate actions. However, Emily was injured right now, and she'd been injured while protecting the others. It wasn't appropriate for her to say anything when Han Shoror expressed his concern for her. Coughing lightly, Phoebe walked to Han Shoror's side amidst the howling cold wind. Worry also appeared on her beautiful face as she reached out a slender hand to wipe away the blood at the corner of Han Shoror's mouth. She said reproachfully, You're spitting out blood and you say you're fine. Phoebe's light cough and her current actions immediately made Emily realize something. Emily, who'd been supported by Han Shoror, smiled lightly and pushed Han Shoror away nonchalantly. She maintained a distance of 2 arms' length from Han Shoror before saying, What do we do now? Now that Valen City has been completely sealed off, I'm starting to worry about the safety of others with Bob Asher's power. Han Shoror's face was dark as he looked at Emily. Nodding, Emily said, That's right. His fury just now wasn't something that could be easily pacified. All along, the transportation matrices connecting Valen City to other cities have never been sealed. This is equivalent to cutting off all communication between Valen City and the outside world. Whether it's orders or news from the Empire or other places, Valen City won't be able to receive them. Bob Asher definitely won't let the matter rest if he dares do this. My opponent this time is Water Archmage Howard, Bob Asher's follower. I originally had the confidence to take care of him, but he found helpers and captured me alive in the end. He wanted some things from the Druidic Order after I was captured, but I would rather die than give them to him. But before you came over tonight, he said that he wanted to capture my little Angelica to threaten me. I'm worried about her safety. Caspian finally came clean at this moment. Honored Master, just where are we flying to? If you don't make a decision soon, we'll have to leave Valen City. Gilbert's voice suddenly sounded in the howling cold wind. Valen City was in a mess now, so the best thing to do was to leave as soon as possible. Leaving this circle of trouble was the wisest choice. However, if they left now, those who were still in Valen City would likely run into great trouble. Han Shoror had a hesitant expression on his face as he looked at the faces of the others. My senior brother treats me very well, I can't ignore his safety. Phoebe spoke resolutely when she saw Han Shoror look at her. I can't give up on my comrade. Candace followed. When Han Shoror looked at Emily, Emily smiled sweetly and said to Han Shoror, Whatever you say, Gilbert, turn around and return to the hotel. After a moment of silence, Han Shoror stomped down on the back of the black dragon and called out lowly. Chapter 184. Gilbert had originally pulled away from Asher and was about to fly out of Valen City's range, but he had no choice but to turn back when he heard Han Shoror's orders. He complained, Honored Master, even the great Gilbert can't stop a Griffin Legion. We'll definitely be discovered if we return to the city with such a large commotion. Cut the crap and fly back to the hotel as fast as possible. We'll pick up the people we need to pick up before we leave. Han Shoror snorted lightly and spoke to Gilbert beneath him. As a dark dragon, there wasn't much space on Gilbert's back for a person to stand on. Even if Han Shoror returned to the hotel, he wouldn't be able to take everyone away at once. He had to start thinking about what to do now. His thoughts raced as he waited for Gilbert to enter Valin City from the outskirts he'd just left. The sharp-eyed Han Shoror had already spotted the Griffin Knights high in the sky, whistling as they patrolled the area. With Gilbert's size, there was no way he'd be able to hide from the Griffin Knights if he wanted to return to the hotel from here. Han Shoror mused for a moment and suddenly opened his mouth. "Gilbert, land immediately before the Griffin Knights discover us. We'll return to the hotel from the ground." Gilbert didn't waste any more words under Han Shoror's orders and flew a certain distance at a low altitude, allowing everyone to land on his back. When everyone had landed, Gilbert's enormous body gradually shrank under the cover of the black light, finally turning back into the tanned and somewhat handsome young Gilbert. "We all wore masks in Aski's manor just now. Now that we're entering the city with our original appearances, they may not be able to recognize us." Han Shoror glanced at Emily and said, "Indeed, but if a group of strangers like us appears together and is discovered by the Griffin Legion, they'll definitely become suspicious. I think we should split up so that no one will associate us with anything." Emily looked at everyone and said, "Well, everyone should know the way back. Let's split into 2 groups and go back. If there's any danger in the hotel, we'll meet up at the block behind." Han Shoror nodded and agreed to Emily's arrangement. After Han Shoror said this, Phoebe naturally stood next to Han Shoror. As a magic pet, Gilbert naturally could not be separated from his master. Emily scanned the crowd and spoke again. "Since this is the case, I'll go with Miss Candace and Elder Caspian. Before Elder Caspian enters the city, use a magic potion to disguise his appearance. Otherwise, he'll be easily recognized," Han Shoror reminded and said to Phoebe and Gilbert, "Let's go." The current Valin City was even more chaotic than the day of Clark's assassination. The chief of the Griffin Legion had used the invasion of Kossi Empire assassins as an excuse to seal off the entire city. Soldiers of the Griffin Legion whizzed past on the streets and in the sky. They immediately went up to interrogate strangers when they saw them. Under Han Shoror's keen eyes and ears, Han Shoror's group of 3 took some rugged and complicated paths and weaved through the shadows of rows of eaves, avoiding many Griffin Legion soldiers along the way. Whether it was Gilbert or Phoebe, they were both people with extraordinary strength. Han Shoror's powerful memory after developing his brain region was put to full use on this return trip. The various complicated paths within Valin City were like a map reflected in Han Shoror's heart. Han Shoror's direction was erratic as he made his way back. In the end, Phoebe felt that they were getting further and further away from the hotel. If it wasn't for the fact that Phoebe was well aware of Han Shoror's mysteriousness, she would have doubted whether Han Shoror was taking the correct path. After taking many small paths and twisting paths, Phoebe and Gilbert were both feeling a bit dizzy and disoriented when the back door of the hotel suddenly appeared in front of them. Han Shoror had actually avoided all the Griffin Legion soldiers on the ground and in the sky along the way. Using some complicated paths, the 3 of them didn't encounter any danger and directly appeared in front of the hotel. "This is too miraculous," Phoebe couldn't help but exclaim softly when she saw Elaine's hotel. Her eyes sparkled as she stared at Han Shoror in praise. "Honored Master, my head is dizzy from all the twists and turns. How did you remember such complicated paths?" Gilbert also had a look of shock on his face as he looked at Han Shoror in disbelief. Pointing at his own head, Han Shoror chuckled, "It can remember everything clearly." These words were useless, but even if Han Shoror hadn't lied and explained that his brain region had been developed, the 2 of them still wouldn't have been able to understand. Therefore, Han Shoror naturally didn't want to say anything more. Han Shoror took a deep breath after saying these words. His eyes sparkled with a black light as he focused on Elaine's hotel. His sensitive ears also focused on the hotel after he focused his attention. Contrary to Han Shoror's expectations, there was nothing out of the ordinary about the hotel. Han Shoror listened for a bit and found that everything was normal inside. There were no sounds of panic, nor were there any sounds of people from the Griffin Legion going over to question them. "You and Gilbert head over first. I'll go find Lawrence and tell them to leave the city as soon as possible," Han Shoror said softly as he looked at Phoebe beside him. Phoebe's beautiful face twisted to look at Han Shoror and she reached out a jade hand. She tightened her grip on Han Shuor's rough hand and said softly, "Be careful. Don't worry, nothing will happen to me." Han Shuor responded with a smile and said to Gilbert, "If there's danger, protect her." Han Shuor was like a shadow in the night as soon as he'd finished speaking, hiding in the darkness behind him and disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. Han Shuor heard a strange sound on the way to Lawrence's residence. His footsteps quickened as he landed on a tree branch. Han Shuor saw Lawrence and Lucky in disguise, as well as the two swordsmen he'd seen last time. They were actually running in the direction of the hotel with Belinda and Johnny of the Calamity Church. Coughing lightly, Han Shuor suddenly called out softly from atop the tree, "Lawrence." Han Shuor's cough startled the group greatly. They tightly gripped the weapons in their hands and immediately faced the tree, almost directly attacking. "Brian, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you have left the city a long time ago? We clearly saw you ride the dark dragon in the manor and leave Asher in the dust." Lawrence looked at Han Shuor with astonishment and said in confusion, "We're back again. Cut the nonsense and meet up at the hotel. We'll leave immediately, we can't stay in Valin City for a moment longer." Han Shuor didn't have the time to explain too much. He casually replied and flew down from the tree, returning to the hotel with Lawrence and the others. Now that he was up close, Han Shuor discovered that not only had Johnny's buttocks been hit, but there was also a large patch of blood on his chest. It looked like his injuries weren't light. Although Belinda still wore a mask, her gaze wasn't as sharp as before. She looked a bit frail and likely had been injured as well. Lawrence and the others had only acted as the mediators in this operation and hadn't participated in the battle. Therefore, they all looked to be in good spirits and it was obvious that none of them had been injured. However, what Han Shuor couldn't figure out was why he was with Belinda. Han Shuor hadn't allowed them to interact with each other before this operation. Logically speaking, they shouldn't know each other. Hesitating for a moment, Han Shuor couldn't help but ask the questions in his heart. He looked at Belinda and then at Lawrence, asking in confusion, "How did you know each other?" "Oh, it's just that when we were retreating just now, we discovered that we were on the same side, so we walked together." Lawrence looked at Han Shuor as if nothing had happened and explained faintly. Belinda nodded when she heard Lawrence's words. "It was because of Mr. Lawrence's help and the large number of experts chasing after you that we were able to seize the opportunity to escape." So that's how it is. Han Shuor felt that things weren't so simple, but since Belinda and Lawrence had spoken thus, Han Shuor couldn't pry any further. Just as Han Shuor, Lawrence, and the others were about to arrive at the hotel, Han Shuor heard a squad of Griffin Legion soldiers questioning the owner of the hotel, Elaine, from afar. Han Shuor could hear Elaine's hearty laughter even from afar. She didn't seem to be worried about the safety of the hotel at all. However, with his astonishing eyesight, Han Shuor discovered that another soldier seemed to have received some sort of order when the squad was talking to Elaine. He quietly left the hotel and quickly made his way to the street in the distance, waving at the two Griffin Knights circling in the air. "Oh no, we must have been exposed." Although he didn't know why, Han Shuor knew that Elaine's hotel was no longer safe. He called out softly and Han Shuor no longer concealed his tracks as he dashed towards the hotel like a bolt of lightning. Chapter 185. Have there really been no suspicious characters recently? An officer of the Griffin Legion looked at the owner of the hotel, Elaine, and asked, "Honorable Sir, our hotel has always had a good reputation in Valin City, and we've often cooperated with Master Asher's work. If there had been any suspicious characters, we would have reported it to you immediately." The fat Elaine was still merrily smiling as she guaranteed that there wouldn't be any problems with the hotel. I think there shouldn't be any problems with your hotel either." The officer's expression was calm as he spoke gravely. A shrill whistle suddenly sounded at this moment as a faint red ray of light streaked through the darkness, piercing towards the officer with a swoosh. The officer who'd been feigning civility with Elaine had long since been on guard, otherwise he wouldn't have sent his soldiers to ask for reinforcements from the outside. Just as the sharp whistle sounded, the battle-hardened officer unsheathed his sword with a chong sound. A dark green do chi suddenly bloomed from the hilt of the sword and immediately went to meet the strand of red light that was shot at him. The demon slayer edge fiercely collided with the blade of his sword with a clang, extinguishing the fighting aura emanating from his body and carving out a nick in the blade he was tightly gripping. At the same time, a figure flashed by like lightning as an iron fist suddenly enlarged and punched towards the officer. Startled, the officer raised his empty left hand and blocked his chest, attempting to block Han Shuor's punch. What had been an ordinary punch suddenly flared up with purple spellfire when it reached his chest. A cold aura suddenly enveloped him and the aura immediately invaded his limbs and bones when Han Shuor's fist landed on his chest. It was as if the officer had fallen into an icy cavern in that moment. Frost appeared on his hair and eyebrows, and his entire body was piercingly cold. He didn't even have the strength to raise his hand. Han Shuor withdrew his tightly clenched right fist and grabbed the Demon Slayer edge that was hovering in the air. He turned around and yelled at the astonished Elaine, "This place is no longer safe. Call out everyone in the hotel and leave now." After recovering from the shock, Elaine quickly recognized the situation. At this time, the strange cries of the Sky Griffins were rapidly approaching, which meant that Han Shuor's judgment was correct. Because of the call of the person who had just left, the Griffin Knights circling the sky were already starting to come over. But Lady Emily hasn't returned yet. When he was about to leave, he suddenly remembered that Emily was the leader of this mission, so he couldn't help but say, "You don't have to worry about that. She'll be back soon." Han Shuor grabbed the Demon Slayer edge and immediately rushed into the midst of the other soldiers who had reacted. He quickly responded. Elaine didn't say anything else after hearing Han Shuor's words. She nodded and turned to the back, yelling out a few words. Angelica, a few mercenaries from the Battlefire mercenary band, as well as Phoebe and Gilbert, who had just arrived, all suddenly appeared. As soon as these people appeared, they didn't wait for Han Shuor's orders before immediately joining the fray, killing the remaining Griffin Legion soldiers beside Han Shuor one by one. "Go, leave this place immediately from the back." Although these Griffin Legion soldiers had died, this place had already been exposed. Add to that the person who had just informed them, this place would definitely become the focus of the Griffin Legion's attack, especially since 2 Griffin Legion soldiers had discovered the abnormalities in this place. Under Han Shuor's orders, the group didn't pack anything and abandoned the hotel, turning around and rushing to the back. Although the owner of the hotel, Elaine, didn't train in any fighting aura, she was extremely fast when she ran and didn't become a burden. Another clamor of shouts suddenly sounded from the distance. Han Shuor's retreating body flipped over and landed on a nearby rooftop. He looked into the distance and discovered that Emily, Candace, and Caspian were on another street, fighting and retreating as they made their way over. Behind them was a line of 12 Griffin Legion cavalry. They rode war horses adorned with silver armor and held sharp spears in their hands, whistling as they chased after Emily's group. They seemed to have discovered the identities of Emily's group. "This way, hurry up!" Han Shuor suddenly yelled out from the rooftop, his voice like a sharp weapon as it traveled to Emily's location. Lawrence's group, who had arrived a beat too late, met up with Phoebe, Candace, and the others at the back of the hotel. Up until now, everyone who had participated in the operation against Bob Asher had actually gathered together again in this hotel. "Gather together, we'll kill our way out before the rest of the Griffin Legion arrives." Standing on the rooftop, Han Shuor seemed to have become the leader of this operation as he yelled out loudly, "Steal the war horses!" Emily, who had been rushing over, suddenly stopped in the dark and chanted a dark magic spell in a low voice. On the way that the 12 cavalrymen were flying over, a large dark swirl suddenly appeared. The war horses charged into the whirlpool, their originally lightning-fast speed suddenly becoming extremely slow. The hooves of the horses didn't make any sound on the ground. Some of the trees in the surroundings seemed to come alive at this moment as their branches danced like snakes, all of them wrapping around the slowed horses' legs. This caused the already slow war horses to stop where they were, unable to move a single step. The great druid Caspian held a magic staff that looked like the root of an old tree and stopped on a large tree to the side. He was concentrating on releasing the magic of the druidic order, binding all 12 war horses. Even the legs of the knights on the horses were entangled as they slumped down on their horses. "Hurry up!" The druid Caspian suddenly called out as well. "Grandpa, are you all right?" Angelica, who had been protected by the Battlefire mercenary band, suddenly cried out in joy when she saw Caspian appear. "Steal the war horses, let's go." Han Shuor's body had already charged out. He turned around and shouted at the group of people behind him while he was in the air. Lawrence waved his hands and didn't have the time to talk to Phoebe. The people beside him, including Belinda, Johnny, Phoebe, and Candace, all dashed out. Their target was the 12 war horses and the riders that had been bound by the magic of nature. Han Shuor had the Great Druid, Swordmaster Phoebe, Archmage Emily, Thunder Mage Swordsman Johnny, Fire Mage Swordsman Candace, and Lawrence's group of experts. With this group of experts, it would be an easy slaughter for the 12 ordinary riders of the Griffin Legion who had their war horses tied up. In the span of a few breaths, the group landed in that direction and each deployed their own ultimate techniques, killing the 12 ordinary riders on the ground in an instant. They threw their corpses down and occupied their war horses. "Let's get out of here quickly. The reason we ran here is because there are more than 100 of these riders behind us." Emily pulled on the reins as soon as she mounted her war horse. The strange cries of the griffins in the sky grew louder and louder when Emily's words sounded. Han Shuor raised his head and suddenly discovered that dozens of black dots were converging in their direction from the distance. With his sensitive ears, he could hear the chaotic sounds of hooves. It looked like this place would be surrounded in a short amount of time. "Follow me, we're charging out immediately." Han Shuor pulled on the reins and turned the warhorse around, sprinting in the direction that Emily and the others had just come from. "You're crazy, there are more than 100 riders behind us." Emily was greatly frightened when she saw Han Shuor turn around and suddenly cried out. Smiling wryly back at Emily, Han Shuor said, "I've thought about it. That's the only way for us to quickly reach the nearest city wall. If we don't leave Valen City as soon as possible, there will be endless trouble in the future. Therefore, we must take the risk." Han Shuor hesitated no longer as soon as he finished speaking. He abruptly charged out on his warhorse, shooting towards the place where the sound of hooves had gathered. Emily only paused for a second and immediately urged her warhorse to follow behind Han Shuor. Phoebe and Candace had worked together with Han Shuor before and trusted Han Shuor's judgment. Gilbert had no objections either as he followed behind Emily. Caspian and Angelica, who were sharing the same warhorse, also shot out after a moment of hesitation. The last group of people were obviously a bit hesitant, but they only hesitated for a moment. In the end, everyone that had gathered in the inn followed the direction that Han Shuor had chosen, charging towards the place where the sound of hooves had gathered. Whether the path that Han Shuor had chosen was a path of life or death was something that they couldn't guess. Under the current circumstances, they could only hope that Han Shuor's judgment was correct. Chapter 186. It was now winter, and the cold night had frozen the low-lying puddles of water on the streets into solid ice. The chilly, knife-like winds howled sharply, as if evil spirits roaming the darkness, intimidating those who saw them. On the wide street, Han Shuor rode his horse as fast as lightning, with a group of people following closely behind. All of them had solemn expressions on their faces, already prepared to encounter great trouble. The heavy, concentrated sounds of hooves sounded from ahead of Han Shuor. Before anyone could be seen, the ferocious aura of 10,000 galloping horses had already charged over, accompanied by the heavy sounds of hooves. The Demon Slayer edge had long since been grasped in Han Shuor's hand. With a callous expression, Han Shuor tossed all distracting thoughts to the back of his mind, focusing his attention to a level it had never been before. Han Shuor's calm breathing and heartbeat seemed to have adjusted to an optimal state with his calmness. Even some of the injuries Han Shuor had sustained previously didn't feel any pain. When Han Shuor calmed his mind, intending to carve out a path of blood through slaughter, Han Shuor suddenly felt a bit dazed, as if he'd suddenly sunk into a strange realm. At the same time, Han Shuor's mind trembled as a profound incantation gradually became clear, reflecting itself in Han Shuor's heart. The demonic art of assimilation was an evil demonic art that could only be mastered when one reached the true demon realm. The effects of the demonic art of assimilation were reflected in the words assimilate and replenish. A demonic practitioner in the true demon realm already had a sufficiently tough demonic body and possessed a demon infant. Once one was injured, they could use the demonic art of assimilation to directly devour the enemy's flesh, blood, and soul to repair the damage to their own body. At this time, if the demon infant wanted to quickly mature, it could also rely on the demonic art of assimilation to devour the souls of its enemies. However, because there were no other cultivators of the Tao or Devil Tao in this world, there were no other demon infants or nascent souls for Han Shuo to devour. Before a living person died, the residual power of their soul would not be extinguished. At this time, he could use the demonic art of assimilation to absorb the soul of a living person and use the power of his soul to replenish his demon infant. This was currently the fastest way for Han Shuo to advance to the next realm. If a person died for a long time, the power of his soul would quickly disappear. In a very short period of time, the remaining power of his soul would completely disappear from the world. Therefore, it was completely impossible to use necromancy magic to summon wraiths to replenish his soul. This was because wraiths were products of another dimension and had died for who knew how long. The power of their souls had long since disappeared, leaving behind only the simplest traces of life. In actuality, the original demons and yin demons that Han Shuo had refined using the original demon cave and the yin demon cave were actually created because Han Shuo's blood essence and demonic yuan were used to bestow the power of the soul to these wraiths that no longer had the power of the soul. The original demons and yin demons that had been created in this way only regained that power after absorbing Han Shuo's blood essence and large amounts of demonic yuan, and possessed some kind of unfathomable ability. As Han Shuo calmed his mind and focused his mind, a section of abstruse incantation magically appeared in Han Shuo's mind. When Han Shuo quickly ran through the demonic art of assimilation in his mind, Han Shuo's body continued to gallop without hindrance. The sound of iron hooves in front of him grew heavier and denser, pounding on Han Shuo's heart like a drum. As his two sharp eyes stared ahead, Han Shuo calmly used his mind to circulate his magical yuan according to the path of the demonic art of assimilation, trying to see if there would be any effects. Contrary to Han Shuo's expectations, when Han Shuo silently circulated his magical yuan, he miraculously discovered that the demonic yuan actually flowed smoothly according to the path of the demonic art of assimilation without any obstructions along the way. Only then did Han Shuo realize that most of the meridians of the true demon realm had been opened and expanded. The meridians of the demonic art of assimilation just so happened to be somewhat similar to the meridians of the mystical glacial spellfire. Some of the meridians were also unobstructed, causing Han Shuo's mind to immediately feel the changes in his body. When Han Shuo circulated the demonic art of assimilation and shifted the focus of his attention to his empty left hand, a thick cloud of black magical aura emanated from the center of his palm, forming a vortex that looked like a black hole. There seemed to be a strange suction force rotating within it, and a black light flashed continuously within it, emanating a frightening evil. The vortex formed from the black demonic aura in his palm wasn't large, but Han Shuo knew that he had indeed grasped the demonic art of assimilation. As for its specific effects, Han Shuo would only truly know when he tested it on someone. Those in front, stop immediately for questioning or be killed without question. At this moment, an explosive roar sounded from the front of Han Shuo. A dense group of knights rode over on their war horses, the silver spears in their hands blossoming with dark green fighting aura, appearing quite dazzling in the darkness. Heh, I'd like to see who's going to kill who. Han Shuo laughed wildly as he squeezed his legs together, causing the warhorse to gallop even faster as he charged directly at the knight. When they were about to meet, Han Shuo had already started chanting necromancy magic in a low voice. The knights at the very front that had attempted to attack Han Shuo suddenly discovered that bone spears had appeared out of thin air and hastily raised their weapons to defend. Another spear thrusting towards him was blocked by the white bone shield that Han Shuo had formed on his left shoulder after chanting. Under the cover of necromancy magic, Han Shuo's momentum was unstoppable as he headed straight for the knight who had yelled earlier. When the Demon Slayer edge's sharpness clashed with the knight's spear, Han Shuo's spear was broken in two on the spot, just as Han Shuo had expected. Taking advantage of the knight's momentary daze, Han Shuo, who'd been whistling past the knight's side, suddenly reached out and grabbed the knight. Han Shuo's physique was abnormally strong. When he grabbed the knight with his left hand, he squeezed hard, causing the knight's shoulder bones to shatter. He then held the Demon Slayer edge in his right hand and used the thick hilt of the Demon Slayer edge to smash the knight's head, causing fresh blood to immediately spray out. The knight, who had been screaming in pain, screamed even more violently after being hit by the hilt of the Demon Slayer edge. However, his struggling body had no strength left, as if he'd been beaten senseless. Han Shoror's left hand that had been tightly gripping the knight's body took this opportunity to circulate the demonic art of assimilation. In a split second, the knight's blood, flesh, and life force rapidly flowed into the whirlpool in Han Shoror's left hand from his neck. A surge of strange energy suddenly surged into Han Shoror's body through the demon infant and Han Shoror's physical body. Due to the influx of this energy, his injured body miraculously and rapidly recovered, as if he'd received a miraculous elixir. Han Shoror could clearly feel that some of the ruptured blood vessels in his chest had miraculously reconnected under the nourishment of this energy. At the same time, the knight that Han Shoror had grabbed with one hand was gradually drying up and turning a grayish-brown due to the disappearance of his blood, flesh, and life force. When Han Shoror finished absorbing his flesh, a strand of his soul was also sucked away by the demon infant like a drop of water. When Han Shoror let go, a gust of cold wind blew past. The body that had lost its blood, flesh, and life force turned into dust that danced in the air. A living life had been extinguished in the blink of an eye due to the replenishment of the demonic art of assimilation, not leaving a trace in the world. As the caster, Han Shoror had absorbed the knight's blood, flesh, and life force in a short amount of time. He had recovered from his previous injuries and was now full of vigor again. The miraculous and evil nature of the demonic art of assimilation gave even Han Shoror a fright. He hadn't expected that the effects of the demonic art of assimilation would be able to absorb the knight's blood, flesh, and life force in the span of a few breaths and use it to replenish his own injured body. This was a classic method of harming others to benefit oneself, but it was in line with the true essence of a demonic practitioner. Disregarding the life and death of others, using the souls and life force of others to quickly recover and advance through slaughter and devouring was a method that demonic practitioners had long since gotten used to for thousands of years. Demon, he's a demon. The knights blocking Han Shoror's way watched with their own eyes as their leader was killed by Han Shoror in such a strange and evil manner. They were all dumbfounded. Someone in the crowd cried out in a panic. Han Shoror's evil methods had clearly exceeded the scope of their understanding, especially when Han Shoror's left hand had devoured the flesh and blood. Blood and broken bones had been splattered as Han Shoror's demonic left hand devoured the flesh and blood. It was even more difficult for them to accept. Han Shoror had already penetrated deep into this group of knights. Because the path wasn't wide enough, the knights in front of him had almost completely blocked the path. Even though Han Shoror was fast, he had no choice but to slow down a little. Han Shoror, who had been prepared to face a cruel attack, suddenly discovered that the enemies around him had all fallen into a daze. Each and every one of them looked at him with fear, and not a single one of them dared to make the first move. Chapter 187. Their momentary daze was broken when Emily and the others behind Han Shoror joined the fray. Emily and the others swarmed over and attacked the knights in front of them mercilessly as soon as they arrived. Dazzling magic and fierce fighting aura exploded at the same time in that instant. It was as if bombs had landed in the center, causing many knights to die or be seriously injured. Faced with the threat to their lives, the Griffin Legion knights who'd just been stunned by Han Shoror's demonic art of assimilation attacked with their lives on the line. Long spears, arrows, and sharp spears suddenly shot towards Han Shoror's group. Because the road had been completely blocked by the Griffin Legion knights, Han Shoror's group would inevitably meet them if they charged over. When these people abandoned their fear and attacked with their lives on the line, they immediately became a hindrance to Han Shoror's group. However, Han Shoror's group were all experts in martial arts and magic. Because the Griffin Legion knights couldn't spread out and surround them, only a dozen or so people came into direct contact with Han Shoror's group from start to finish. They were naturally no match for them in this way. The Griffin Legion knights were all cut down in an extremely short amount of time. It was a pity that there were more than 100 of them, and they were all experienced warriors. When they fought back fearlessly, the speed of Han Shoror's group was also hindered. The strange cries of the Griffin Legion came from the direction that Han Shoror's group had come from. Han Shoror only needed to listen for a moment to immediately understand that a large group of Griffin Legion knights should be rushing over. Perhaps Asher would also be among them. Charge forward, or else it'll be too late. Han Shoror roared and turned to glance at Gilbert, instructing, "Transform into a dragon and crush everything for me." Gilbert's body flew up from his warhorse under Han Shoror's roar, transforming into the enormous body of a dark dragon in midair. Gilbert's body whizzed past on the narrow street. He opened his mouth and spat out a stream of flames, engulfing a dozen or so Griffin Legion knights. Muffled footsteps sounded at this moment as the armored golem that looked like Ansidesi charged into the crowd under Belinda's control. Together with Gilbert, they unleashed the terrifying destructive power of their enormous behemoths, attacking the knights like a disaster. Han Shoror observed carefully and discovered that there were a few more obvious scratches on the golem's armor compared to the last time he'd seen it in Elaine's Inn. Although the armored puppet beast was still as ferocious as ever, it was a pity that it seemed to be in a sorry state compared to the last time. Even its speed seemed to have slowed down. Han Shoror didn't need to think too much to know that the golem must have been injured when he tried to assassinate Asher in the manor. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in this state. Just as Han Shoror was about to turn his head away, he suddenly discovered that Lawrence's eyes were sparkling with extreme excitement. He stared at the armored golem with sparkling eyes, and couldn't help but sigh in admiration. Perhaps Lawrence had wanted to save Belinda because he'd taken a fancy to the golem's value. If such an enormous creature with astonishing destructive power could be used as a weapon of war, then whether it was to attack a city or to plunder land, it would be extremely effective. It was no wonder that Lawrence was so excited. With Gilbert and the golem leading the way, Han Shoror and the others immediately felt much more at ease. Han Shoror and the others made their way through the ruined streets with ghastly wails and howls, planning on continuing forward. At this moment, several enormous earth spikes suddenly shot out from the ground in front of them. Each spike was several meters long and fiercely pierced towards Gilbert, who was flying low in the air. Two water dragons formed from water magic that looked like icicles also suddenly appeared and shot towards Gilbert. Gilbert, who'd been yelling excitedly, was caught off guard and was hit. His enormous body tumbled to the ground with a loud crash. After being bombarded by him, a group of knights who were still alive shot all their weapons at him, causing him to be wounded once again. "Damn it, you've injured me. I'll kill you." With a miserable howl, Gilbert let out a shrill cry and spat out flames at the two water and earth archmages in front of him. With a shake of its enormous body, it destroyed a few houses around it and flew up once again. "Let's go." One of the archmages called out calmly, and the two used the levitation spell to fly into the air, leaving in another direction. "Don't chase, let's get out of here quickly." Han Shoror saw that Gilbert was madly chasing after the two archmages and immediately yelled out to stop him from leaving. Gilbert had just made his debut and lacked battle experience. Add to that his arrogance, it was no wonder that he'd suffered at the hands of the two archmages. If it hadn't been for Gilbert, the slow-moving golem wouldn't have been able to blast open a section of the city wall when they reached it. Therefore, Han Shoror absolutely wouldn't allow Gilbert to act on his own at this time. Due to the connection of the contract, although Gilbert raised his head and yelled a few words in the air after Han Shoror's order, he still obediently continued to charge forward in the end. However, because he'd just been injured, Gilbert's flying speed was no longer fast enough. It seemed that his injuries had once again affected his physical body. The strange cries of the griffins grew closer and closer. As Han Shoror and the others fled for their lives, the group finally appeared at the city wall closest to them. The scattered soldiers of the Griffin Legion along the way were instantly disintegrated under this attack. "Blast open a section of the city wall," Han Shoror ordered once again. Gilbert and the armored golem charged towards a section of the city wall at the same time. The sturdy city wall only creaked and trembled under the tremendous impact, but didn't collapse in an instant. In order to defend Valin City against the Kossi Empire's invasion, the city walls are all made of sturdy rocks. Rather than using the Black Dragon to blast open the city walls, it's more convenient to fly over. When they arrived, Emily saw that Gilbert's blow had no immediate effect, and immediately suggested, "Don't worry, I'll be fine." Taking a look, Han Shoror made a prompt decision. Those who can't fly over the city walls immediately sit on the dark dragon's back. Those who can use levitation spells, dismount your steeds and fly over. As a dragon, he would rather die than let a warhorse that was many times lower than him climb over his head. If he did so, it would become a lifelong stain on his reputation. Gilbert was naturally no exception. Han Shoror had long since understood this taboo, which was why he'd given up on the idea of having the dark dragon take his steed with him. Angelica and the others from the Battlefire mercenary band who couldn't fly, as well as Candace and Caspian, immediately abandoned their steeds and leapt onto Gilbert's back under Han Shoror's orders. Emily, who was a magus, grabbed the fat hotel owner, Elaine, and slowly flew into the air. Third Prince Lawrence also used an expensive flying scroll and easily took the assassin Lucky into the air. His speed wasn't slow either. It looked like the flying scroll that could only be used once must have come from a wind Grand Magus. Belinda and Johnny of the Calamity Church, whom Han Shoror hadn't paid much attention to, surprised Han Shoror when Belinda, the great alchemist, released a flattened golem the size of a kite. This golem seemed to be made of strange wood and actually carried Belinda and Johnny into the air. They weren't at their wits' end as Han Shoror had expected. It was only at the critical moment that this group of people revealed their hidden methods. It was also at this moment that Han Shoror suddenly discovered that apart from the Battlefire mercenary band and the great druid Caspian, everyone else was rich. They all had flying devices to flee for their lives. When he discovered that everyone was in position, Han Shoror's body leapt up and landed next to Phoebe. Phoebe was just about to leap onto the dark dragon's back when Han Shoror abruptly closed in and hugged her. Under Phoebe's panicked expression, Han Shoror used the art of the demonic ninth heavens and took Phoebe's fragrant body into the air. A faint fragrance flowed into Han Shoror's nostrils because of the two's close proximity. Phoebe's breathing was a bit ragged in her panic as a strange light flickered in her eyes. She pressed her lips to Han Shoror's ear in disbelief and cried out in surprise, "How can you fly?" It wasn't just Phoebe. Even Lawrence, Candace, and the others who'd discovered Han Shoror's strange movements were flabbergasted. They all cried out in disbelief on the dark dragon's back, unable to understand how Han Shoror could fly. What was even more astonishing was that Han Shoror could fly at the fastest speed with Phoebe on his back. He crossed the city walls in the blink of an eye and landed on the other side, continuing to fly through the air. He hadn't used the soaring spell on the way here because it was an exhausting method. Han Shoror, who trained in magical yuan, exhausted his magical yuan, while Emily, who studied magic, exhausted her mental strength. For an archmage like Emily, using the levitation spell to fly was extremely taxing on her mental strength. Flying for a long period of time would quickly exhaust an archmage's mental strength. In addition, for an archmage like Emily, even if she used the levitation spell, her speed wouldn't be that much faster than riding a warhorse. Even for an incomparably powerful dragon, flying through the air for a long period of time was exhausting. Gilbert had already flown a great distance with the group, and he'd also been injured by the Dark Elves. Han Shoror hadn't told him to fly with Angelica and the others because he had a warhorse. However, the warhorse had been abandoned and the Griffin riders were hot on their heels. Even for the group, flying wasn't an easy task. They could only grit their teeth and fly as fast as they could, hoping to get as far away from Valen City as possible. The pursuers didn't relax in the slightest. When Han Shoror and the others crossed the city walls and continued to fly forward, Han Shoror, who was high up in the sky, saw the grand formation of thousands of Griffin Legion riders and the dense black dots in the sky, chasing them relentlessly. It looked like Asher was truly enraged this time and wouldn't rest until he killed Han Shoror and the others. Up ahead was the Kurlan Grand Canyon that separated them from the Kossi Empire. There were mountain ranges of various sizes around the canyon, with lush vegetation and sparse human habitation. Once they entered that wide area, even Bob Asher and the others on griffins would find it harder than ascending to the heavens to find Han Shoror and the others. Therefore, once the target was confirmed, Han Shoror once again became the leader. After explaining the situation at the very front, Han Shoror held Phoebe in his arms and the black dragon carried Candace, Angelica, and the others behind him. They galloped forward with all their might. In this dangerous moment, everyone sped forward with all their might. Perhaps it was because they were competing with each other, but Lawrence and Belinda actually had excited expressions on their faces as they looked at Han Shaw in front of them. Their speed increased again and again, as if they wanted to pull Han Shaw down. With Phoebe in his arms, Han Shaw didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he saw the two chasing after him excitedly. Everyone was running for their lives right now. He didn't know what these two were up to, as if catching up to him would prove something. He didn't know what they were doing this for. You've kept both of them in the dark in this operation. You've been the commander from start to finish. These two proud and arrogant people must be a bit angry. Now that you're flying faster than them with me in your arms, they're even more furious. Phoebe looked behind her and said to Han Shaw in a soft voice, "So that's the case. That doesn't seem necessary." Han Shaw was surprised and said strangely, "If you weren't the one I liked, I would also want to defeat you if you kept pressing down on me in all aspects." "Hihi, that's human nature," Phoebe explained in a low voice and then mischievously said into Han Shaw's ear, "Will you defeat them?" Laughing heartily, Han Shaw's heroic spirit soared to the heavens with the beauty in his arms. He even completely forgot about the danger he was in. He said in a low voice, "Hold me tight, I'll make them despair." Chapter 188. The art of the demonic ninth heavens that Han Shaw practiced wasn't just a bit more advanced than the levitation spells that the archmages of this world had mastered. When Han Shaw activated his magical yuan and flew through the air at full speed, his speed was unimaginably fast. Because he'd used the demonic art of assimilation to absorb the blood, flesh, and soul of a knight, Han Shaw's injuries from his clash with Asher had already healed. Now that Han Shaw was flying at full speed, he was like an arrow loosed from a bow. He flashed through the dark night and disappeared without a trace. Lawrence and Belinda were inwardly rejoicing as they saw that Han Shaw was getting closer and closer to them, when they suddenly discovered that Han Shaw's speed had doubled and he'd disappeared from their line of sight. Shaking his head with a wry smile, Lawrence's heart was filled with emotion. He'd gained a deeper understanding of Han Shaw's miraculous abilities. It was also at this moment that Lawrence made up his mind to make Han Shaw his subordinate. How was it? Han Shaw slowed down a bit after pulling away from Lawrence and Belinda, holding Phoebe in his arms as he spoke. "How did you do it?" Phoebe's voice was filled with surprise. "Heh, don't worry about that. I can fly through the air anyways, but it's not because of necromancy magic." Han Shaw smiled faintly as he explained. The sky had brightened after a night of battle and pursuit. As the sun rose, the Curlin Grand Canyon was bathed in the morning light and was covered in silver. Looking back, Han Shaw discovered that Dark Dragon Gilbert, Emily, and Belinda were gradually approaching. After waiting for a while, when they flew towards Han Shaw saw a cluster of black dots in the distance. Judging from the distance, Han Shaw discovered that his group had maintained an ideal distance from the Griffin Legion. Seeing that the Curlin Grand Canyon was already in sight, Han Shaw encouraged everyone, "As long as we enter the Grand Canyon, the Griffin Knights won't be able to find us thanks to the complicated terrain and the thick, snowy trees." There was no need for Han Shaw to say anything. Everyone knew what to do at this time. Everyone was shaken, and with even more enthusiasm, they charged forward with all their might. As expected, they landed in the Curlin Grand Canyon before the Griffin Knights could reach them. The Curlin Grand Canyon was vast, with mountains, rivers, and lakes in great numbers. It was located between the Lancelot Empire, the Cossi Empire, and the Orc tribes. Past the Curlin Grand Canyon, heading west was where the Orcs lived. Heading north was the border of the Cossi Empire. Heading south for a few days, one could reach the city of Zajoski in the southwest of the empire. The Orc tribes of the Lancelot Empire, Cossi Empire, and Cossi Empire surrounded the Curlin Grand Canyon in a triangular shape. Therefore, this place didn't belong to any of the countries. Whenever war broke out, the Grand Canyon could become a place where troops could be stationed or engaged in battle. Due to the special terrain, there were also some towns in this place, with people from the Lancelot Empire, the Cossi Empire, and the Orc tribes residing within. They would make use of this special terrain to conduct transactions that would benefit both sides. Before war broke out, merchants and adventurers from the 3 countries could interact amicably in these towns. Of course, as the escapees, Han Shoror's group didn't plan on hiding in these towns. Everyone descended from the sky as soon as they entered the Kurlan Grand Canyon. Phoebe, who'd been out doing business for many years, and Emily, who'd been out on missions, immediately took over Han Shoror's command. The 2 girls discussed briefly and decided on a direction to head in. The thick snow on the trees around them almost covered the sky. For Han Shoror's group, this place was very suitable for hiding. As long as they leaned against a random tree, the Griffin Knights circling in the sky wouldn't be able to find them. Therefore, after everyone descended from the sky, they deliberately walked towards places with lush vegetation as they treaded on the snow. It was obviously inconvenient for Han Shoror to carry Phoebe at this time, so he tugged at Phoebe and gestured for her to leave his embrace. As a sword master, Phoebe first squirmed in Han Shoror's embrace, seemingly greedy for the warmth emanating from Han Shoror's body. However, when she discovered that everyone was walking on foot and that Candace was looking at her with a smile that wasn't quite a smile, she blushed and hurriedly left Han Shoror's embrace. As casters, Emily, Angelica, and the others were all wrapped in thick, flesh-colored coats. After flying through the night and being buffeted by the frigid wind for so long, they were all shivering from the cold. Their footsteps slowed down a bit at this time. Seeing that Emily's beautiful face was a bit pale from the cold, Han Shoror felt a bit of pain in his heart. He looked left and right and suddenly suggested, "We've already entered the Kurlan Grand Canyon anyways. There are trees blocking the sky here and it'll be hard for the Griffin Legion to find us. I see that everyone is a bit tired after a busy day. It's not wise for us to continue on our way now. Why don't we find a hidden place to rest first?" Everyone readily agreed after Han Shoror's words. Phoebe's bright eyes spun as she suddenly thought of something. She turned and said to Han Shoror, "I've been here a few times and I remember that there's a hidden cave nearby. I've stored some goods there before, we can rest there. Alright, we can look around. It'd be best if we can find this place." Han Shoror was overjoyed and said with a smile. Phoebe then furrowed her brow in thought and pointed in a direction. She said, "If I remember correctly, it should be there. Let's go take a look." When the group approached, they discovered that apart from a thick layer of snow, there were no traces of a cave. Phoebe was startled for a moment and then said with certainty, "It should be here. It looks like the entrance to the cave has been blocked by snow. We'll know if we dig a bit." "Then what are we waiting for?" Lawrence called out briskly. It looked like he trusted this junior sister quite a bit. He took out his long sword and stabbed fiercely at the place Phoebe was pointing at. The Mags and Belinda all seemed to want to come over and help when they saw that Lawrence had made his move. Han Shoror suddenly called out at this moment, "Slow down, don't use any magic. We should be careful and move the snow away from the cave entrance. This way, we won't leave any obvious traces when we enter. Even if the Griffin Legion gives up on the Griffins and comes down to search, they'll find it hard to find us." Everyone immediately agreed after Han Shoror's words. Han Shoror, Lawrence, and Phoebe then carefully dug, moving large chunks of snow away. "It's here all right, heh. Phoebe stirred the long sword in her hand after moving away a large patch of snow and suddenly cried out in surprise. Han Shoror and Lawrence then looked at each other and moved away the somewhat thick snow that had gathered at the entrance of the cave, revealing a pitch-black cave entrance. Looking inside, Han Shoror discovered that the space inside was as wide as a basketball court. It looked like it could accommodate everyone on this side. "Go in, one by one. Don't expand the entrance anymore, or else it'll be hard to hide," Han Shoror said and moved his body away from the cave entrance. Little elf Angelica, who'd long since been shivering from the cold, breathed out hot air and was the first to walk in. Emily, Candace, and the others all entered the cave one by one. After Phoebe and Lawrence went in as well, Han Shoror found some branches and placed them in the cave. He then casually picked up some of the snow that had just been pushed away and sprayed some onto it. When Han Shoror felt that it was sufficiently hidden, he carefully observed the surroundings and walked into the depths of the cave. A bonfire had already been lit at the entrance of the cave after a while, and a warm wave of heat suddenly spread into the cave. The originally cold cave instantly became a warm zone. With the existence of space rings, mags would always bring some dry firewood in the cold winter, in case they needed to keep warm. Soft blankets from the other tents were also taken out by the various factions and placed next to the bonfire. The mags then comfortably entered their own heating equipment to obtain warmth. Emily and Caspian's somewhat stiff limbs slowly relaxed from the warmth of the bonfire. Sighing in contentment, Emily slowly stood up and walked towards the door. I'm going to set up a concealment boundary at the entrance of the cave to prevent this place from being discovered. As Emily did so, Caspian also stood up and walked towards the entrance of the cave with Emily. He said, I'll go help her as well. When Emily and Caspian got up to set up the boundary at the entrance of the cave, Belinda and Johnny of the Calamity Church had obviously uneasy expressions on their faces. Their eyes flickered as they looked at the entrance of the cave with great wariness, as if they were afraid that Emily and Caspian would do something to the entrance of the cave. This was indeed the case. Han Shoror had been walking over, but when he saw Emily and Caspian go over to set up the entrance of the cave, he unintentionally turned his head and immediately understood that Emily and Caspian were indeed on guard and had really done something to the entrance of the cave. Miss Belinda, you should pay us the commission you owe me. Just as Han Shoror was feeling astonished, Candace was already staring at Belinda with a displeased expression as she spoke coldly. Everyone had been at peace with each other before because they had a common enemy. The Griffin Legion was hot on their heels and they couldn't relax for even a moment, which was why they hadn't settled their debts with each other. Now that the threat of the Griffin Legion was temporarily gone, the already hostile group immediately began to oppose each other. You're already very lucky to be alive right now. I'm sorry, but our Calamity Church has never had the tradition of paying commission. Belinda's voice was still quite gentle as she flicked a glance at Candace and responded nonchalantly. Clang. Belinda unsheathed the broadsword on her back and glared angrily at Belinda. I escorted you all the way to Valin City and not only did I not receive a single gold coin in commission, you even almost killed me. It looks like it's time for us to settle our debts. If you plan on making a move, I think you'll regret it. Belinda was obviously unafraid of Candace's threats. She turned to look at Johnny and took out a scroll that contained a golem in the form of a three-eyed evil god. This cave is only 3 meters tall. I don't believe that your armored golem will be of any use. Candace laughed coldly and walked towards Belinda, looking like she was about to make a move. Phoebe had been standing next to Han Shoror and was like a sister to Candace. When she saw that Candace was about to make a move, she unsheathed her long sword without hesitation and a milky white fighting aura suddenly flared up from it. Belinda's previously disdainful expression suddenly brightened when she saw the milky white fighting aura blossom from Phoebe's long sword. She seemed a bit surprised. Mitch, you're courting death. The wound on Johnny's chest had been treated and was now bandaged with a piece of gauze. Lightning crackled as he raised his sword, and his aura wasn't the slightest bit weaker than Phoebe's. Give them the commission, this is what you should pay. Otherwise, only death awaits you. Han Shoror quickly recognized the situation and walked to Phoebe's side with a callous expression, snorting coldly as he stared at Belinda. Gilbert cackled oddly as he cracked his knuckles. Caspian and those of the Battlefire mercenary band also stood next to Candace. It looked like they would immediately make a move if Belinda didn't back down. Although Belinda's voice was soft, her temper was quite stubborn. She didn't show any signs of timidity at this moment and seemed to be prepared to fight head-on. Now doesn't seem to be the time for internal strife. Heh, Miss Candace, how much money do they owe you? I'll help them pay it. Let's not argue about this matter for now, okay? Lawrence suddenly stood up at this moment and smiled to smooth things over, contrary to everyone's expectations. Chapter 189. Shaking her head, Candace refused Lawrence's suggestion and looked resolutely at Belinda, exclaiming, "This isn't just a matter of money." Candace obviously held the upper hand in the current situation. With the help of Han Shoror and the others, Belinda and Johnny wouldn't be able to gain any advantage at all. It could be seen from Belinda and Johnny's attire and weapons that the Calamity Church didn't lack money. Belinda only needed to pay a few gold coins to quell Candace's anger, but she was stubborn to the point of being a bit baffling. Those of the Calamity Church aren't people that you can threaten. Johnny, who was already injured, had a scar on his face that looked even more ferocious because of his angry expression. The long sword in his hand that flickered with the power of thunder and lightning emitted a dazzling electric light. Just as Hanshoro was about to speak, Johnny's body moved quickly and he suddenly charged at Hanshoro, his face full of murderous intent. The long sword in his hand that carried the power of thunder and lightning was like an electric dragon in his hand, bursting with a terrifying power of thunder and lightning, illuminating the dimly lit cave. Watch out! Johnny's sudden attack caused Phoebe, Emily, and the others to be greatly shocked and couldn't help but cry out in warning. A pile of white bones suddenly gathered in midair, forming a white bone shield in an instant, blocking the front of the lightning longsword. 2 bone spears shot out and collided with Johnny's lightning longsword before the white bone shield had formed. Creak creak, the bone spear exploded and sparks flew. Under the impact of Johnny's momentum, the lightning longsword bombarded the white bone shield with a bang. In an instant, the bone fragments on the white bone shield immediately broke into chunks. Johnny's sword had been obstructed twice, but it still persisted in its attempt to stab Hanshoro to death. The Demon Slayer edge finally whistled out of its sheath as a cold glint flashed in Hanshoro's hand. Hanshoro gave a muffled grunt as his body stumbled back a few steps. The lightning on Johnny's long sword suddenly flickered and then extinguished. Johnny's momentum also slowed at this moment. When he was about to make another move, Caspian, Emily, Phoebe, and the others were already standing next to Hanshoro, glaring angrily at him. "It doesn't seem that I'm your enemy." Having steadied himself, Hanshoro first circulated the magical yuan through his body and confirmed that there were no major injuries. He then focused his cold gaze on Johnny and spoke faintly. "You deceived us in the operation against Bob Asher this time and used us as cannon fodder. Apart from helping us send a few people away, you didn't do anything at all. Now that the matter has passed, don't pretend that we don't know what you're planning. You deserve to die the most." Johnny's expression was savage as he looked coldly at Hanshoro. As the chief of the Griffin Legion, whether or not Hanshoro and Emily had concrete evidence, they didn't have the right to kill Asher, much less assassinate him. If Hanshoro and Emily had joined forces with the Calamity Church to kill Asher, then the two of them would certainly suffer the consequences in the Dark Mantle. In addition, Hanshoro, who was well aware of Asher's strength, also understood that killing Asher in Valen City wasn't something that they could do. Only religious fanatics would act recklessly without regard for their own lives. Nodding, Hanshoro smiled faintly and said, "Since things have been made clear, then don't blame me for burning the bridge after crossing it. You've already made a move against me, so don't blame me for not holding back." Hanshoro turned his head to look at the wry smiling Lawrence after saying this and said with a smile, "You wouldn't be thinking of helping them now, would you?" Spreading his hands, Lawrence took a few steps back and said with a wry smile, "I was originally very interested in the Calamity Church's golem and wanted to obtain the manufacturing methods of the golem through friendly means. But now I think that's not quite possible." Lawrence's words confirmed Hanshoro's previous guess. Lawrence was someone who only cared about his own matters, and yet he'd suddenly extended a helping hand to Belinda and Bob. He had other plans indeed. Lawrence's words now meant that he was standing on Hanshoro and Phoebe's side. Nodding, Hanshoro smiled faintly at Lawrence and said, "Many thanks. Do you think that you've won against us for sure?" Belinda, who was standing behind Johnny, still had a calm expression on her face. She only spoke at this moment and reached out to take out the item that sealed the golem, preparing to make her move. "Heh, you won't have the chance." Hanshoro laughed and used the demon infant to communicate with a drop of blood essence hidden in Belinda's body. With a thought, the cold air contained within the blood essence entered Belinda's body. She felt her neck go numb and she fainted backwards. What did you do to her?" Johnny was greatly startled by Belinda's sudden collapse. He looked at Hanshoro with a bit of panic. "She'll live, but there's no need for you to exist. It's too dangerous to keep you alive." Hanshoro snorted coldly and suddenly opened his mouth to chant a necromancy spell. A hate warrior appeared out of thin air and 3 zombie warriors blocked Hanshoro's path. Johnny immediately knew that Belinda wouldn't be able to help him when he saw that the situation had developed to this point. He hesitated slightly and immediately turned to flee, attempting to leave through the only hole. Emily and Caspian suddenly started chanting magic incantations. Just as Johnny's body landed at the entrance of the cave, several thick tree roots agilely entangled him, and a cloud of black gas floated towards him. "You can't escape." Emily giggled and chanted another spell. The black gas seemed to be some sort of binding as Johnny's body suddenly stiffened as soon as it neared him. The nimble tree branches then seized the opportunity to entangle his body. Johnny was a thunder and lightning demon swordmaster all right. He was still able to move after being restrained so many times. He raised the long sword in his hand with great difficulty, planning to chop off the tree branches that bound his body. However, the 3 zombies and the hate warrior had already closed in on him at this moment. A bolt of lightning flashed as the long sword sliced through the air, hitting the first 2 zombie warriors. Electricity abruptly invaded the bodies of the 2 zombie warriors, and when the long sword sliced through the air, the 2 zombie warriors suddenly froze in place and didn't move again. When he brandished the long sword with great difficulty and was about to make a move on the other zombie warrior, the nearby hate warrior smashed down with a club, landing directly on Johnny's right hand that was holding the sword. The sound of bones breaking suddenly rang out. Johnny's face was full of pain as he howled in agony, the long sword in his hand falling to the ground. Han Shoror, who had been standing beside Phoebe and the others, flashed and landed behind Johnny like lightning. With his back facing Phoebe and the others, he used the demonic art of assimilation and sucked Johnny's howling soul into the demon infant. When the power of the demon infant slowly corroded Johnny's soul, Han Shoror, who seemed to have eaten a great tonic, finally threw a punch at Johnny's back. With a thud, the life in Johnny's eyes faded and he fell to the ground powerlessly, a hand imprint appearing on his back. After killing Johnny, Han Shoror's demon infant expanded and started to use the nature of demonic arts to purify the power of Johnny's soul, turning it into food for the demon infant's growth. As a thunder and lightning demon swordmaster, the power of Johnny's soul was clearly much more abundant than that of the Griffin Knight. When Han Shoror did this, he could clearly feel the growth of the demon infant. He's dead. On the other side, Emily slowly walked over when she saw that Johnny had been killed by Han Shoror. When Emily discovered that Han Shoror was standing there motionless and hadn't looted Johnny's body like he usually did, she couldn't help but remind Han Shoror, he's dead. Han Shoror, who was concentrating on comprehending the characteristics of the demon infant, was startled awake when he heard Emily's call. He continued to silently circulate the demonic art of assimilation without batting an eyelid. Han Shoror nodded at Emily and pointed at the fallen Johnny. "You take care of this, I'm going to rest for a while." Han Shoror sat down cross-legged on the spot after saying this and focused on comprehending the changes in the demon infant after absorbing Johnny's soul power. The stronger a person was, the more powerful their soul power would be. When Johnny's soul power had been sucked into the demon infant, strands of power flowed into the demon infant and seemed to speed up its growth. The demon infant was the foundation of the true demon realm. Han Shoror would only be able to break through his current realm and enter the next realm, the bloodlust realm, once it had reached a certain level. Only in this realm would Han Shoror need large amounts of soul power to replenish himself. When the demon infant was strong enough and reached the bloodlust realm, it would be considered a minor success and would be able to display even more wondrous uses. At that time, the demon infant would no longer need to replenish itself with soul power. Everyone was chattering away as Han Shoror meditated. After Belinda was captured and Johnny was killed, there were no eyesores left in the cave. Candace saw that Belinda had been magically knocked out by Han Shoror and didn't bring up the matter of payment again. She chatted happily with Phoebe and Emily. It was only now that Lawrence and Phoebe had the time to talk. Caspian had been missing for a long time and now that he was with Angelica, he breathed a sigh of relief. Angelica was the one who'd asked him to recount his experiences over the past 2 days. After a while, Han Shoror, who had been meditating indifferently, suddenly opened his eyes and raised his finger to make a shushing gesture. Everyone kept their mouths shut and watched as Han Shoror cautiously walked to the entrance of the cave and then stick his ear to the entrance. Everyone's minds that had just relaxed became alert again. Rustling footsteps slowly grew louder as they approached from afar. The sound of a few people's conversations also traveled into everyone's ears at this time. The Kurland forest covers such a large area, it's impossible to find those people who've escaped in. What's the point of searching aimlessly? A voice said. Indeed, but the chief has truly gone mad with anger this time. Not only have his 2 sons been killed, but there's someone who's so audacious as to try to assassinate him in Valen City and still manage to escape from the city. The chief has fought in all these years and has experienced all sorts of situations, but has never been as humiliated as this time. I don't think he'll rest until those people are captured and killed. Another person followed up with a sigh. I've heard that such a big incident happened in Valen City this time because the chief offended someone from the capital. If that's really the case, then the chief is in big trouble. Who knows if we'll be in trouble as well? Don't worry, we're all just following orders. No matter what happens, it shouldn't matter as long as we understand the situation. In addition, we're not the chief's trusted Griffin Knights. We should still listen to His Majesty the Empire. We'll just follow orders until something big happens. Let's go, there's no place to hide here. Let's go somewhere else. The group talked as they passed by the cave Han Shuro and the others were in, but didn't discover anything out of the ordinary. Their voices grew further and further away, finally disappearing into the distance. Another 2 groups passed by after this group. Because of Emily and Caspian's arrangements, the cave entrance was very well hidden. They didn't discover anything out of the ordinary and didn't linger here in the end. Alright, it's been a tiring night. Everyone get some rest. Han Shuro waited for a while after the 3 groups left. He smiled at the people inside when he saw that there was no movement outside. Everyone sighed in relief and nodded in agreement. They either meditated or slept, sitting by the warm bonfire. Everyone rested for the entire day in the cave and discovered that it was already night after they'd rested their minds. Han Shuro closed his eyes and rested for a day, purifying and absorbing Johnny's soul energy. His mental strength and magical yuan had also recovered. It's night now. I think they've probably given up after a day of searching. We can leave now. Han Shuro stood up and spoke in front of the door. Having rested enough, everyone stood up one after another. After putting away their things, Emily and Caspian removed the boundary in front of the door and the group walked out of the cave. Chapter 190. A bright crescent moon hung high in the sky as its cold moonlight sprinkled down, illuminating the world wrapped in silver and making the night quite bright. The surroundings were exceedingly quiet, without the slightest sound. It wasn't just humans and beasts that didn't want to leave their caves in the cold winter night. Even some small insects seemed unwilling to leave their caves. When the group walked out of the cave, they immediately felt that the temperature outside was much colder than in the cave. Even though they'd been mentally prepared, they still couldn't help but tighten their thick clothes and exhale lightly. There's no time to lose. I think it's best if we leave as soon as possible and return to the Empire. Han Shuro looked around at the group and spoke lowly. It was unknown if Griffin Legion Commander Asher had discovered that the important items in the secret room had been stolen after the commotion. When he returned to Valen City with no results from this search, he'd discover the problem with the secret room sooner or later. At that time, he'd definitely be driven to desperate action. Therefore, Han Shuro and Emily had to deliver the information they'd obtained to the senior executives of the Dark Mantle as soon as possible, so that they could deal with Asher as soon as possible and prevent him from stirring up trouble. There are a few ungoverned towns in the vast area of the Kurland Grand Canyon. The Dark Mantle has a few strongholds here, and the largest stronghold has a magical device that can contact the senior executives of the Dark Mantle. Brian and I need to get there as soon as possible. We're in very little danger now, so it looks like it's time to part ways. Emily mused for a moment and then suggested with a smile. When I entered Elaine's hotel, the merchant company escorting the goods with me had already left Valen City, so I'm working alone now. I've already told them that nothing will happen to the merchant company for now. I'll return to the Empire with Brian. Phoebe stood beside Han Shuro and expressed her stance. Caspian and Lawrence thought about it for a moment and both expressed their intention to part ways with Han Shuro. Caspian solemnly expressed his thanks to Han Shuro, and Lawrence's gaze roamed over Belinda, who had been captured by Emily. He then said, "Brian, if you can get the method to refine a golem from her, I'm willing to pay a great price for it." Nodding his head, Hanshaw expressed his understanding and said with a smile, "I will ask her, but I advise you not to have too much hope. I think that even if you have the method to refine puppets, you can't mass-produce them. Otherwise, with the Calamity Church's financial resources, they would have long since formed an army of puppet." Lawrence stared blankly at Hanshaw's words, then opened his mouth again to say, "Even if you can refine one or two, it would be of great help to me." "All right, I'll try my best." Seeing that Lawrence still hadn't given up, Hanshaw said helplessly, "Big bad guy, will we meet again?" On the other side, Angelica suddenly stared at Hanshaw and said crisply as Caspian was about to leave. Shrugging his shoulders, Hanshaw said dashingly, "I think so. We've already met twice in such a short period of time. We're quite fated. All right, thank you again. If you have the chance in the future, come visit the Elven tribe in the Dark Forest. Angelica will treat you well." Caspian bowed to Hanshaw and said with a smile. Lawrence and the others didn't linger when Caspian and Angelica left, walking in the opposite direction from Caspian and Angelica. After Caspian and Angelica disappeared, Hanshaw thought that if Caspian and Angelica found out that he was the leader of the Dark Forest Troll, the two of them would hate Hanshaw to a great extent. It was best not to visit the Elven tribe. Senior Swordsman Davis of the Battlefire Mercenary Band felt dejected after Angelica's departure. This valiant swordsman's gaze was still fixed in the direction that Angelica had disappeared in, lost in thought. "Candace, how much does this Belinda owe you?" "I'll pay it for you. We still have a use for her, we can't give her to you." Emily looked at Candace at this moment and took out her crystal card, seeming to want to pay Candace. "Forget it, Sister Emily, we don't lack these gold coins. Let's just consider this mission a failure, it's no big deal." Candace hurriedly declined when she saw that Emily was about to pay. She then looked at the mercenaries behind her and said to Emily and Phoebe, all right, we need to leave as well. We still need to continue the mission when we return." Candace didn't wait for Emily to pay the gold coins after she'd finished speaking and quickly fled with the mercenaries. Because they couldn't fly and Hanshaw and the others were in a hurry to leave, Emily told Elaine the address and had her take Belinda there. Because Hanshaw had released the cold air, Belinda wouldn't wake up for a while without Hanshaw's help, so Emily and Hanshaw didn't need to worry about Elaine's safety. After Elaine grabbed Belinda and left, only Hanshaw, Emily, Phoebe, and the strangely quiet dark dragon Gilbert were left in front of the cave. "Hey, why are you so quiet all of a sudden?" Hanshaw finally remembered that Gilbert hadn't made a fuss in a long time and couldn't help but ask in surprise. Gilbert had been standing there silently with his eyes closed when he heard Hanshaw's question. He immediately opened his eyes with a long face and said, "What a disloyal master. I've been injured along the way and have been recuperating whenever I have the time. Why have you only thought of me now?" Hanshaw finally remembered that the attacks of the two archmages and a group of knights had hit him when they charged out of Valen City. He'd then flown for so long with a group of old and weak soldiers on his back. No wonder he'd suddenly become so quiet. "Don't worry, your skin's thick anyways." Hanshaw chuckled naughtily and thought for a moment, "How about this, you get the hell back home first and I'll take you out after you've recovered. I've only been out for a few days and you're chasing me back again." Gilbert immediately yelled loudly when he heard that Hanshaw wanted him to return to the cemetery of death. "Go, be a good boy or I'll show you what's coming. Now that I'm with two beauties, it'll be so inconvenient to bring you along, not to mention that you're injured." Hanshaw laughed naughtily as he took out his magic wand and set up a matrix. He grabbed Gilbert's shoulder as he yelled and kicked him in regardless of whether he was willing or not. His mental strength moved and the matrix was immediately activated. Gilbert also disappeared without a trace. Without the Eye of Darkness, even Gilbert wouldn't be able to walk out of the cemetery of death. Therefore, Hanshaw didn't have to worry about Gilbert making trouble after sending him in. Off to the side, Phoebe stared in astonishment at the miniature magical matrix that Hanshaw had set up and directly sent Gilbert to some unknown place. She couldn't help but exclaim softly, her bright eyes looking at Han Shaw with even more astonishment. Heh, it's just a transportation matrix, there's nothing strange about it. Let's go, we can also leave this place. Han Shaw chuckled lightly and put the items into his space ring, urging Emily and Phoebe to leave. Traveling with the two beauties wasn't a happy thing. The originally cold and aloof Phoebe had been intentionally acting very intimate with Han Shaw along the way. This made Emily, who already had an intimate relationship with Han Shaw, look at Han Shaw with a bit of bitterness. As a mage, Emily was still shivering in the cold night even though she was wrapped in thick fur clothing, making Han Shaw's heart ache. However, perhaps to avoid arousing suspicion, Emily purposefully kept a distance from Han Shaw, as if afraid that Phoebe would discover her relationship with Han Shaw. Han Shaw carried Phoebe and flew through the air along the way, while Emily expended her mental strength to use the levitation spell to fly close to the ground. However, as an archmage, Emily expended her mental strength to use the levitation spell to fly for a limited amount of time. Han Shaw had already discovered that Emily's lips were a bit pale when it was almost midnight. Han Shaw, who was flying with Phoebe in his arms, suddenly increased his speed and landed next to Emily. He said, "I'll fly with two people, there won't be any problems." Regardless of whether Phoebe agreed or not, Han Shaw reached out and wrapped his arms around Emily's soft waist as soon as he'd finished speaking. He continued to fly through the air with Phoebe in his right hand and Emily in his left. He also silently circulated his magical yuan, sending warm heat into Emily's cold body. Emily struggled a bit after being embraced by Han Shaw's left hand, attempting to leave Han Shaw's embrace. However, Han Shaw held her firmly in place, making it impossible for her to move at all. When Emily turned her head to look at Han Shaw, she discovered the heartache and determination in Han Shaw's eyes. She couldn't help but feel a sweetness in her heart. Whether it was because of the heat entering her body or some other reason, Emily felt her cold body heat up in an instant. The previous coldness faded in an instant, and her entire being seemed to be enveloped in warmth. "I see that you seem to be very familiar with the way you're holding her." At this moment, Phoebe's cherry lips moved to Han Shaw's ear and she spoke softly with a hint of jealousy. She didn't seem to be afraid that Emily would hear her words. "We need to get to the Dark Mantle's location as soon as possible. There will be major problems if we're late, so I'll fly with you too. This is the fastest way." Han Shaw's expression was indifferent, and he didn't express anything because of Phoebe's words. They were silent the rest of the way. Han Shaw circulated the art of the demonic ninth heavens to its limits, and split out an extra portion of magical yuan to warm Emily's body. He followed Emily's directions as fast as lightning and shot towards a mountain range in the Kurlan region. Even with Han Shaw's magical yuan, he had to use a portion of it to warm Emily while circulating the art of the demonic ninth heavens to fly. This enormous consumption was a bit hard to bear. By the second half of the night, Han Shaw was already panting and sweating. "Take a rest, look how tired you are." Although Phoebe had been a bit jealous just now, her feelings for Han Shaw were sincere. She couldn't help but speak with heartache when she saw Han Shaw sweat. On the other side, Emily was also feeling heartache. She had wanted to open her mouth to persuade Han Shaw, but when she saw that Phoebe had already spoken, Emily didn't say anything else. By now, Han Shaw was indeed a bit tired. From last night until now, he'd fought and then fled. Even when he'd arrived in that cave, Han Shaw had spent the entire day digesting Johnny's soul with the demon infant. Therefore, his body hadn't had a good rest. A pair of eagle-like eyes scanned the surroundings sharply. Han Shaw's sharp eyes discovered a tree hole. He brought Emily and Phoebe to a stop at the entrance of the tree hole. Pushing aside some snow, Han Shaw poked his head in and discovered that there was still some space in the hollow tree hole. "Let's rest inside," Han Shaw suggested. The top of the tree hole was tightly sealed, with only a long and narrow hole at the root. When the three of them entered, they discovered that they weren't exposed to the cold wind. He used his own body to block the hole, while Phoebe, Emily, and the other two squeezed to the sides. Although there was some space in the tree hole, it was still too cramped for all three of them. The three of them were tightly pressed together, their arms and legs leaning against each other. It was a bit difficult to move around. As soon as he relaxed, Hanshaw took a deep breath and the magical yuan within his body automatically circulated, recovering the energy he'd just expended. The speed was extremely fast. Emily and Phoebe were pressed against Hanshaw's front and sides, with Emily's chest and abdomen against Phoebe's back. Hanshaw's chest was against the two's shoulders, his hands were separated between his legs, and his legs were facing the narrow gap between Emily and Phoebe. It was nighttime and the only source of light in the tree hole was blocked by Hanshaw's back, making the inside of the cave pitch black. Apart from Hanshaw, the two girls' vision had been affected and it was difficult for them to see their surroundings clearly. In this place, Hanshaw's chest was pressed against the two girls' fragrant shoulders. Out of concern for Emily, Hanshaw circulated his magical yuan, intending to send a bit of warmth to Emily. Therefore, Hanshaw twisted his left hand that had originally been on his left thigh and slowly placed it on Emily's thigh. Chapter 191. A wave of warmth approached. Emily and Phoebe both felt it at the same time. Emily felt it on her thighs, while Phoebe felt it on her perky buttocks. When Hanshaw's large hand landed on Emily's thigh, Emily's body trembled. She thought that Hanshaw was trying to make a move at this moment, so she immediately raised her leg to block it. Hanshaw's left hand, which was caressing her thigh, was pushed back by her thigh and landed on Phoebe's perky buttocks. A soft cry came from Phoebe's mouth. In the darkness, Hanshaw saw that Phoebe's beautiful face suddenly burned hot. As a mage, Emily's clothes were very thick. However, Phoebe was a sword master and her body's ability to withstand the cold was far superior to the weak Emily. Therefore, her clothes weren't very thick. In addition, a sword master needed to move freely in battle. Her slender thighs were clad in ordinary warrior robes. When Hanshaw's hand landed on them, he could feel the fullness of her buttocks. Within the darkness, Phoebe's face was completely red. Her pair of bright eyes sparkled as her heart thumped wildly. She thought to herself that this extremely daring big pervert actually dared to take liberties with her in such a place. Truly too hateful. With her heart beating wildly, Phoebe twisted her neck and glared fiercely in Hanshaw's direction. At this moment, Hanshaw had a different feeling and couldn't help but turn his head to look at Phoebe. When he saw Phoebe's reproachful gaze, Hanshaw grinned and made a funny face. There was no light in the tree hole, but because the three of them were very close together, Phoebe could still see Hanshaw's funny face. She couldn't help but feel angry, but there was nothing she could do. She could only continuously curse Hanshaw, this big pervert, how audacious of him. Hanshaw had originally planned on giving Emily some warm air, but because of Emily's bashfulness, his large hand had mysteriously landed on Phoebe's butt. Because Hanshaw had already taken advantage of Phoebe in Valin City before, and because the two of them had confirmed their relationship, Hanshaw wasn't a good person. He shamelessly put his hand on Phoebe's butt and greedily rubbed it. He felt so good when he moved like this. Her soft and plump buttocks gave him a wonderful feeling even though they were separated by clothes. But Phoebe, who had never experienced sex before, felt the temperature of her delicate body rise continuously as he took advantage of her so wantonly. Her originally calm breathing also became a bit heavier. In such a place, Emily and Phoebe's vision was somewhat affected, but Hanshaw could see everything clearly. Not only was Phoebe's face flushed red and her eyes blurred, but even the hot air coming out of her cherry lips due to her chaotic mood was clearly seen by Hanshaw. At this time, Phoebe's charming expression fell into Hanshaw's eyes, causing Hanshaw to become even more aroused, and the movements of his hands became even more unbridled. His large hands, which were originally separated by her clothes, suddenly felt that the thin layer of clothing became an unbearable hindrance. Then, Hanshaw's large hands moved up, nimbly pushing aside Phoebe's clothes on her waist, directly sticking to her warm and smooth waist without any hindrance. When Phoebe's breathing intensified, he unceremoniously moved down to touch her plump buttocks. In this way, not only was Phoebe's face red, but even her neck was densely covered in red. She could no longer suppress the sound of her breathing and couldn't help but let out a soft moan. Just as Hanshaw's heart was dripping with joy and was still eating heartily, he suddenly heard Emily cough softly, and then felt a pain in his waist. Emily had fiercely pinched him. If it were another woman, Han Shoror would probably be a little embarrassed, but Emily and Han Shoror had long been intimate, and the two of them had enjoyed each other's company countless times. Therefore, Han Shoror didn't have any qualms about Emily's existence at all. After being pinched by Emily, Han Shoror turned his head to look at Emily. His left thigh trembled, and he forcibly squeezed Emily's buttocks, using his knee to prod Emily. Emily's heart was also stifled by Han Shoror's actions. She inwardly felt that Han Shoror's lust had reached the heavens. It was one thing for him to violate Phoebe in front of her, but now it seemed that he was going to do the same to her as well. Her slender hand that had been on Han Shoror's waist to pinch him slowly moved down at this moment and landed on Han Shoror's erect lower body, suddenly squeezing hard. "Oh!" A strange cry suddenly came from Han Shoror's mouth. His erect lower body was forcefully pinched by Emily, causing Han Shoror to involuntarily cry out in pain. Han Shoror, who had originally planned to violate both women, suddenly withdrew his hands and feet. "What's wrong? What's wrong with you?" Phoebe, who had lost her self-control a moment ago, immediately woke up when she heard Han Shoror's scream. She appeared a little flustered as she asked Han Shoror, "There's a squirrel inside. It probably bit him, and now it's flying away from the hole behind him." Emily's strange voice sounded in the darkness as if nothing had happened. Han Shoror could hear the pleasure in Emily's voice. "Little slut, you actually dare to pinch me there. See if I don't teach you a lesson next time." Han Shoror's teeth itched with hatred as he silently thought of how to punish Emily. "Isn't that right, Brian?" Emily laughed delightedly when she saw that Han Shoror didn't respond. She purposefully asked Han Shoror, Yes, an abominable squirrel bit me. If I catch it, I'll definitely make it wish it was dead." Han Shoror couldn't say anything. Not only did he have to swallow the bitter pill, but he also had to pander to Emily. He felt very sullen inside. "We've taken over its place, so it's only right that it treats us this way. Don't think about killing people and setting fires every day." Phoebe's voice had only just recovered its usual indifference now as she spoke faintly in the darkness. "Miss Phoebe, your body temperature is a bit high, and the sound of your panting just now was a bit loud. Is it because you've been traveling in the cold wind for the past 2 days that your body has been frozen?" Emily was very happy to see Han Shoror suffer such a setback. It was as if she'd found a way to vent all of the resentment she'd accumulated along the way. She naturally didn't take the threat in his words to heart. However, Emily couldn't completely release the resentment in her heart just because Han Shoror had suffered such a setback. Her heart stirred, and she deliberately pretended to be concerned as she asked Phoebe. "Cough. I think so." Phoebe's cheeks had just returned to normal when she heard Emily's question. She couldn't help but blush again as she responded with some embarrassment. "Brian, look at how cold you've made Miss Phoebe. Why aren't you hugging her a bit tighter to give her some warmth? But don't you dare take advantage of her here." Emily laughed delicately as she spoke softly. Han Shoror and Phoebe were both a bit embarrassed. Emily's words had a hidden meaning, and Phoebe naturally understood them. She also knew that Emily must have found out about the embarrassing incident between her and Han Shoror. She couldn't help but glare fiercely at Han Shoror in the dark. At this point, Han Shoror naturally understood that it was impossible to take advantage of Phoebe and Emily. For someone as perverse as Han Shoror, his body wouldn't be affected even if he stood naked in a world of ice and snow. In order to prevent Emily from continuing to blabber, Han Shoror directly said, "I'm going to relieve myself. You two can rest here." Han Shoror didn't wait for the two girls to speak as he struggled out of the tree hole after speaking. He took a few steps to relieve himself, then retreated to a spot not far from the tree hole where Phoebe and Emily were. He sat down cross-legged in a pile of snow and calmed his heart to silently circulate his magical yuan. After an indeterminate amount of time, Han Shoror felt that the magical yuan had already formed its own cycle, and his body had recovered to its peak condition. A strong throbbing suddenly occurred in the depths of his heart. An indescribable call seemed to be imprinted in the depths of his heart from an endless distance. It was as though there was a voice in the depths of his heart that was giving him a message to return to its side immediately. Han Shoror was shocked. He didn't know what was going on at first, but when Han Shoror discarded all distracting thoughts and focused all his attention, he suddenly discovered a mysterious connection that hadn't been severed even though they were separated by an endless distance. Perhaps this connection had always existed, but Han Shoror had only just discovered it now. This was the call of Little Skull from an alternate dimension. When Han Shoror felt this call, as though it was asking for help, the greatly shocked Han Shoror immediately used the most basic skeleton summoning spell to summon Little Skull from an infinitely distant alternate dimension. He relied on this weak but unseverable connection to summon Little Skull to him. The bones on the little skeleton's body creaked and swayed, as though it had just experienced a great battle. The bone dagger in its hand danced wildly in the air. The bones on its body showed signs of shattering. The 7 bone spurs on its back, which were originally sharp, actually looked a little blunt, perhaps because it had been chopping at hard objects for a long time. From Little Skull's physical condition and its current movements, Han Shoror was certain that Little Skull must have been in a foreign world and engaged in a battle with the creatures there. Moreover, Han Shoror could feel that it was indeed Little Skull calling for help just now. All of this made Han Shoror feel a little incredulous. Chapter 192. Looking at the Little Skull in front of him, who had a few broken bones and was still waving his bone knife, Han Shoror felt a little disappointed. All this while, Han Shoror had never treated this Little Skull as just an ordinary dark creature that fought for him. From the moment he learned necromancy magic and summoned this small skeleton, he had become an indispensable partner for Han Shoror. Before he learned how to fight, the Little Skull freed Han Shoror from the tedious chores, helping him take out the trash and clean up. When Han Shoror used demonic arts to refine him, the relationship between the Little Skull and Han Shoror was not as simple as that of a summoner and a summoned creature. Later on, whenever Han Shoror was in danger, the Little Skull would play an important role, helping him out of danger. However, Han Shoror now realized that the Little Skull should really have a strange connection with him. Han Shoror never knew what the Little Skull had encountered and done in the other dimension, nor did he try to find out. If it wasn't for Han Shoror's calmness this time, he might not have heard the Little Skull's call for help. If he missed this summon, the Little Skull might no longer exist in the other dimension. When Han Shoror thought of this, he felt a little guilty. However, because Han Shoror's necromancy magic had not reached a certain level, Han Shoror could not understand what was going on in the world where the Little Skull existed. Other than some dark creatures summoned by the necromancy magic, he did not know if there were other unknown existences. Of course, the possibility of going directly from this dimension to that dimension was something that Han Shoror could not achieve at the moment. When Han Shoror closed his eyes and tried to communicate with the Little Skull, he suddenly realized that the Little Skull seemed to have realized that the environment around him was different. He stopped waving his hands and feet and looked around in confusion. When he finally looked at Han Shoror, he suddenly quietened down. It was also at this moment that Han Shoror could feel that the chaotic and intense aura on the Little Skull had suddenly calmed down. It was as if when he saw Han Shoror appear, he thought that his crisis had been resolved and he was truly safe. This was a kind of wordless trust, an instinctive dependence. Just like when a naughty child saw a fierce beast, he would cry and make a ruckus. But when his parents appeared by his side, regardless of whether his parents had that kind of ability, he would take it for granted that his parents could protect him from harm and help him resist all dangers. An inexplicable emotion suddenly surged into the bottom of Han Shoror's heart. At this moment, Han Shoror felt a little suffocated in his heart. A complicated feeling filled Han Shoror's heart. For a moment, Han Shoror had an illusion that this Little Skull that was made up of bones was as close to him as his own child. It was a feeling that he would never be able to let go of. "All right, it's all right now." Very naturally, Han Shoror walked to the Little Skull's side and reached out his big hand to stroke the Little Skull's smooth skull. He spoke in a soft and comforting voice. Han Shoror could clearly feel that this simple sentence of comfort had made the Little Skull's originally quiet mood a little happier. "Who are you talking to?" Inside the tree hole, Emily and Phoebe walked out at the same time. Phoebe was a step ahead and heard Hanshaw's very soft voice. She felt a little jealous in her heart and thought that Hanshaw was talking to that woman again. Therefore, she couldn't help but ask in astonishment when she didn't see anyone. But when she saw Hanshaw caressing the little skull's skull with a face full of affection and an unprecedentedly gentle voice, she immediately lost all feelings of jealousy and looked at Hanshaw with a somewhat strange gaze. All along, the necromancers of the profound continent had only used the summoned dark creatures as their tools. Phoebe had never heard of any necromancer who would treat a dark creature so intimately and affectionately like Hanshaw. Therefore, when Phoebe saw Hanshaw do this, her heart was immediately filled with astonishment. Then, Phoebe's heart spun, thinking that the reason why the little skull was so miraculous might have something to do with its master's different treatment of it. It seemed that Hanshaw's miraculousness wasn't just because of his special martial arts techniques, but also because some of his miraculous methods were indeed different from ordinary people. Turning his head to smile faintly at Phoebe and Emily, Hanshaw's gaze swept over the delicate and alluring faces and found that the two girls seemed to be in good spirits. He asked with a smile, "Have you both rested well? All right, if you don't have any questions, can we continue on our way?" After a period of meditation, it seemed that Emily should be able to continue using the levitation technique and was itching to make a suggestion. If she could let the higher-ups of the Dark Mantle know about what she had in her hands as soon as possible, then the plan to deal with Asher could be carried out even faster. As a qualified member of the Dark Mantle, Emily obviously knew that the difference in the final outcome of a matter was like heaven and earth. That was why she was so anxious. "All right then, let's go now." Hanshaw didn't waste any words and grabbed the little skull's waist with one hand. His body flashed and he appeared in front of Phoebe in a flash. His other hand reached out and landed on Phoebe's soft waist that didn't have a trace of excess flesh, and he suddenly flew through the air. The morning sun slowly rose, and the afterglow of the sunlight was a faint red, illuminating the silver world below with a captivating red. It was as if a peerless beauty with fair skin had suddenly blushed because of shyness. Towering mountain valleys crawled beneath them. Some magical creatures that didn't fear the cold pushed open the snow caves they were hiding in and stretched out their sharp claws. The mountain valley below them blossomed with hidden vitality under the cover of the rising sun. Yesterday's cold, but now Emily's body had become warm because of the morning sun. Her tender and beautiful face welcomed the bright red sunlight and revealed a sweet smile. She looked around in the air with great interest, as if she wanted to imprint the scenery below her into her heart. "The scenery is so beautiful." Phoebe's eyes were bright and her cherry lips moved slightly as she spoke with Hanshaw's arm around her waist. Hanshaw also quickly glanced at his surroundings when he heard her words and responded with a "MHM." He then continued to rush forward quickly without another word. Using scenery to express their emotions was what these women cared about. Right now, Hanshaw only wanted to get to that place as soon as possible and finish this mission as soon as possible. After flying for over an hour and passing through two small valleys, Hanshaw discovered a large valley in the distance. The sun was already high in the sky at this time. The vicinity of the large valley wasn't covered in thick snow, and the ground was clean and tidy. Low buildings of various styles were scattered in rows on the small mountain, Tanai. On the streets that had been cleaned up, humans, orcs, and elves with different appearances and different clothing walked out of the buildings they lived in. "We're almost there, let's go on foot." Behind him, Emily could easily see the general scenery in the distance under the illumination of the sun. Her voice sounded a little cheerful. This place was somewhat similar to the town of Droll, but a bit more complicated. Although they both had inns and places to indulge, the adventurers and merchants in the town were basically all from the Lancelot Empire. In addition, the town of Droll was also managed by Lancelot Empire soldiers. However, the adventurers and merchants in this place weren't only from the Lancelot Empire, but also from the Kossi Empire and the Orc tribes. There were also people from even further countries, or some of the rare races that lived in the Kurlan Grand Canyon. Of course, such an ungoverned place naturally didn't belong to any single country. In Tanai of the Sunshine Valley, the greatest power is the Keeper of Order. They're in charge of protecting the rights and interests of the traders and preventing the invasion of bandits. All along, The three countries here have their own powers. When one side is so strong that the other two don't have any objections, this power will take over the order here and collect huge fees from the merchants and adventurers. They're in charge of everything here. Of course, this power isn't unchanging. If one side can prove that they're superior and can suppress the other two, then the Keeper of Order will change. Currently, the Keeper of Order here is the Cairo mercenary band from the Kossi Empire. Emily and Han Shuror descended from the sky and slowly explained to Han Shuror as they walked towards the Valley of Sunshine. If the Keepers of Order here serve their own country, then wouldn't that infringe on the rights and interests of the adventurers and merchants from other countries? Han Shuror thought for a moment and asked in astonishment. Don't worry, no matter which country they came from, as long as they become the Keepers of Order here, they absolutely won't seek benefits for their country. Otherwise, they'll be ostracized by all the adventurers and merchants and won't have the chance to regain their power here. There are no national boundaries within the Kingdom of Sunshine. Not participating in the conflicts between countries is the first iron rule that the Keepers of Order must follow. Emily laughed lightly and explained to Han Shuror. Nodding, Han Shuror indicated that he understood and thought that this place was quite interesting. People from different countries all came here for their own selfish motives. Large transactions between the three countries would surely allow the Keepers of Order here to earn a considerable amount of gold coins. Han Shuror naturally wasn't too clear on these common-sense rules. Along the way, Emily and Phoebe explained to Han Shuror one by one. Han Shuror listened very carefully. When they arrived at the management office of the Valley of Sunshine, they discovered that tall iron fences had been set up. A few knights in ash-brown armor guarded the iron fences, all of them wearing grave and stern expressions. From Emily and Phoebe's conversation, Han Shuror knew that these people were from the Cairo mercenary band from the Kossi Empire. This mercenary band had an astonishing strength of 2,000 to 3,000 people. There were experts of all professions within the band. They trained constantly and were even stronger than the regular army of an ordinary country. They had their own strict system and reasonable division of professions. In the year or so since they'd taken over the Valley of Sunshine, they'd fended off many bandits' attacks and displayed a combat strength that satisfied the Tanai merchants and adventurers. Where are you from? Do you have a pass? Do you need to apply for it now? A tall and rather handsome knight stood by the iron fences. He was exceedingly courteous when he saw Emily and Phoebe walk over. He had a charming smile on his lips as he asked in a gentle voice. I'm from the Boot Merchant Guild. These two are with me. This is my pass. Phoebe's expression was cold and arrogant. She took out a pass from her space ring and indifferently handed it over. This mature knight respectfully reached out to receive Phoebe's pass. After a moment of inspection, he smiled and handed it back to Phoebe. He said courteously, "No problem. The Valley of Sunshine welcomes your arrival. The Cairo mercenary band will be responsible for the safety of your lives and property." She casually took out a bag of gold coins and threw it on a round table in the iron fences. Phoebe's expression was as cold and inhuman as ever when she was dealing with outsiders. She said faintly, "This is the fee we should pay." Phoebe turned to look at Han Shuror as soon as she'd finished speaking. She extended a slender hand and took Han Shuror's arm. The arrogance on her face faded as she smiled sweetly. "Let's go, we can go in now." A stunning beauty like Phoebe didn't care about the men around her at all. She'd put on a haughty and unapproachable attitude and then suddenly changed her attitude to a slightly fawning smile at Han Shuror. This immediately caused the Cairo mercenaries to look at Han Shuror with envious expressions. However, when they saw the little skull that Han Shuror was holding, a strange expression appeared on their faces. However, they didn't say anything. It seemed that they'd met many strange people. There was nothing wrong with an adventurer like Han Shuror who'd brought a dark creature with him. Everyone had their own vanity. Han Shuror also felt that he'd gained quite a bit of face when these people looked at him with such envious gazes. He inwardly thought that this little wench Phoebe had really given him face. "Let's go, you bastard." Emily didn't know what he was thinking when she saw Han Shuror's smiling face, but his footsteps paused. She couldn't help but roll her eyes at him and give him a gentle push from behind. Laughing heartily, Han passed through the iron fences under the envious gazes of the mercenaries and walked straight into the depths of the Valley of Sunshine. Chapter 193. Han had already made a rough tour of the Valley of Sunshine when he was in the sky. Now that he was here, he discovered that there were all sorts of strange buildings in Tanai. These buildings were made from different materials, such as sturdy grey stone bricks or 100-year-old tree trunks. Some of the roofs were round, while others were pointed like smoking pipes. It was precisely because there were merchants and adventurers from various countries in this area that the style of the buildings here also had some strong local characteristics. Some people walked out of the houses on the street early in the morning to clear away the accumulated snow from the day before, clearing out a clean space in front of their doors. It was like a small city with all sorts of shops here, a dazzling array of goods from various countries. The ones who open shops around here are all small merchants. The real big merchants are only here to stay for a few days. Because they've already contacted each other beforehand, they'll leave after they've finished their business here. This wasn't the first time that Phoebe had come here. She held on to Han arm and explained softly. "All right, you guys can walk around as you please, I'll take care of things first. When you're tired, you can rest in the last shop on this street. I'll arrange for someone to pick you up." Emily immediately spoke after she'd entered, concerned about the mission this time. Nodding, Han understood that Emily was burning with anxiety and said, "Go ahead and take care of business first. We'll come find you later." After Emily left, Phoebe's thoughts raced as she suddenly remembered something. She said to Han "Oh right, I haven't had time to collect all of the materials on the other list you gave me. There are rare items from various countries here. Why don't we take a look? Perhaps you'll find the materials you need." After hearing Phoebe's words, Han finally remembered that he'd asked Phoebe to help him collect the materials to refine the Wood Elite Zombie. The Earth Elite Zombie and the Yin Demon Cave were both operating in an orderly fashion within the Cemetery of Death. However, Phoebe hadn't gathered all of the materials for the Wood Elite Zombie yet. Now that Phoebe had suggested this, Han readily agreed. Therefore, under Phoebe's lead, Han followed behind her, starting from the first shop on this side and strolling through them one by one. With Han accompanying her, Phoebe appeared to be quite happy. As the leader of a large trading firm, Phoebe became quite shrewd when she interfered in this kind of transaction. Whenever they passed by a few shops that had materials that Han needed, she would often be able to tell the true price of a material without batting an eyelid. She threw out more than 7,000 gold coins without the slightest hesitation, forcibly obtaining a batch of materials that Han desperately needed. When Han took out his crystal card to pay, Phoebe glared at him and said, "You still have gold coins with me, why are you taking out money?" Han was speechless and didn't bother with this matter anymore. He only followed behind Phoebe and watched her coldly haggle with the owners of several shops along the way. There were indeed many rare materials in this glorious Tanai. Even the black iron ore and black gold ore that couldn't be found within the Empire could be found in 2 shops. There were even some items that were strictly prohibited by the Empire that were openly displayed here to attract customers. For example, there were some powerful aphrodisiacs and hallucinogens, powder that could melt corpses with a single drop, and even some powerful weapons that had just been developed by various countries, as well as the crystal cores and bones of some powerful magical beasts. They were all available. The owners of these shops might be humans, orcs, elves, or even some strange merfolk that lay half of their bodies in the pool. Because they were using the human language to communicate, there were no barriers to communication. When Phoebe and Han had finished walking around, both of them felt that this trip hadn't been in vain. Both of their space rings had gained some rare materials. "All right, it's about time. Let's go meet up with Emily today. A shop like this glorious Tanai isn't something we can finish in a day. As long as we put in some effort, I'm sure we'll be able to make up for the few materials you're still lacking." They entered a dozen or so shops in a row, haggling with all of them. Even Phoebe was a bit tired and couldn't help but say to Han after walking out of another shop. Unknowingly, the sky above the Valley of Sunshine was as red as blood, illuminating the entire valley in a sea of red. It was already evening. After such a long time, Emily should have finished her business. Han Shoror was also anxious to know how she was doing. Listening to Phoebe's words was exactly what he wanted, so he and Phoebe headed towards the place Emily had pointed out. Because he didn't know what danger Little Skull had encountered in the other plane, Han Shoror didn't put him back into the other dimension and kept him by his side. In this glorious Tanai, there were all kinds of strange characters from all kinds of races. Han Shoror with a little skull didn't seem all that special. But when they headed towards the place Emily had pointed out, Little Skull suddenly stopped in front of a shop. He stood there motionlessly, his empty eyes looking at the door as if he was interested. Han Shoror was startled and looked at Little Skull with some surprise. He then looked at the tightly shut door of the shop, not knowing what was inside that attracted him and made him stop in his tracks. What's wrong? When Phoebe saw that Han Shoror and Little Skull had both stopped, her body also stopped moving. She turned back to look at Han Shoror and asked in surprise. Han Shoror had a strange expression on his face as he lifted his head to look at Phoebe, then continued to stare at Little Skull. There's something inside that attracted her. Phoebe had only been a little puzzled at first, but when she heard Han Shoror's words, the puzzlement on her face turned into shock. She looked left and right to make sure that no one was paying attention to them, and then walked to Han Shoror's side. She looked at the Little Skull with an incredulous expression and said to Han Shoror, "You're saying that he has his own thoughts?" Nodding, Han Shoror said with certainty, "That's right, I'm sure that's the case. I haven't figured out what's going on yet, so don't ask me what's going on, because I don't know when this started happening either." Phoebe was even more astonished when she heard Han Shoror's words, her pretty face full of confusion and confusion. When Phoebe looked at the shop, she suddenly cried out in surprise. When Han Shoror looked at her, she couldn't help but explain, "Why is it this shop? It's not the first time I've come to the Valley of Sunshine, but I've never seen this shop open. I think that the person inside isn't willing to sell anything, otherwise they wouldn't close the door." It was indeed as Han Shoror had said. Every shop in the Valley of Sunshine wished for everyone to enter, but this shop's door was actually covered up, as if no one lived inside. It was a bit out of place on the bustling street. Suddenly, Little Skull, who had been standing there all this time, walked towards the shop without Han Shoror's orders. He reached out his hand and pushed the door open. To Han Shoror's surprise, a soft creak sounded as the seemingly tightly shut door suddenly swung open, revealing a cobblestone walkway. Phoebe started and said hesitantly, "Entering someone else's shop without permission is against the rules of the Valley of Sunshine. Is there someone inside?" "There's someone inside." Han Shoror nodded and followed Little Skull inside. He suddenly called out, wanting to see if there was anyone inside. Unfortunately, Han Shoror didn't hear any response even after calling out a few times. Little Skull naturally didn't know any rules and directly walked deeper into the shop. Spreading his hands at Phoebe, Han Shoror said, "There's no one here anyways, it shouldn't matter if we go in and take a look." Han Shoror then turned around and closed the door that Little Skull had pushed open. He gave Phoebe a meaningful glance and grabbed Phoebe's little hand as they walked inside. After passing through the hallway, Little Skull went straight to the backyard where there was a deep, circular well. Little Skull stood next to the well after coming over and poked his head in to look inside. No one knew what he was looking at. When Han Shoror and Emily came over, Han Shoror suddenly felt that there seemed to be a cold, evil presence within the well, as if some kind of powerful demon existed within. "Something's wrong, the temperature here is too low, even I feel a bit cold." Phoebe's body suddenly trembled as she looked at Han Shoror. "That's right, this is a place of extreme water, a place that I must refine into a water elite zombie. The dense water chi within has been absorbed by the vengeful spirits and has most likely formed water demons." Han Shoror's face was filled with ecstasy as he spoke excitedly. Han Shoror drew closer and felt with his heart. He could clearly feel the dense water chi within, as well as two cold and sinister presences. This made Han Shoror understand that the water element within had been absorbed by the vengeful spirits and formed into two water demons. Chapter 194. The deep well was circular in shape and could accommodate one person. The blue stones that were used to make the well were cold to the touch, chilling to the bone. Han Shuro stood beside the deep well and could feel the rich water yuan qi in the deep well. Perhaps it was because the two cold auras had sensed the presence of a living person, but they had already begun to stir in the deep well. In such a place, there was a deep well with a place of extreme water below. This made Han Shuro ecstatic in his surprise. If the 5 elemental corpses were all refined, they would form a great formation that would have an extremely amazing power. Now that Han Shuro had found the place of extreme earth and extreme wood, if he added this place of extreme water, he would be one step closer to success. As Han Shuro was secretly rejoicing, Phoebe suddenly frowned and said, "It seems to be a little colder." "You said this is a place of extreme water. What do you mean?" 2 bone-piercing cold air suddenly spread out from the deep well. The originally calm deep well suddenly gurgled and splashed water. Clouds of white mist suddenly floated out from the deep well and scattered in the courtyard like clusters of clouds. "It's here." Han Shuro snorted coldly and reached out to grab Phoebe. He said solemnly, "The water demon has come out to cause trouble. Be careful." The water yuan qi in the place of extreme water was very rich. If someone drowned in such a place, their soul would not immediately dissipate into the world. With the nourishment of the water yuan qi, as long as the soul knew how to absorb even a little bit, it would form a strange existence called the water demon. When the water demon absorbed the water yuan qi, the power of the soul would be greatly enhanced. It could use its special ability to manipulate the yuan qi in the place of extreme water and attack any living beings that approached. Han Shuro had already understood all of this information when he learned about the refining method of the 5 elemental corpses. Therefore, after arriving here, when Han Shuro sensed the existence of 2 cold auras in the deep well, he immediately understood that there must be 2 water demons forming inside. However, Han Shuro still did not understand why the little skull was able to sense this place. What was there that could attract him? Little Skull held the bone knife in his hand and stood next to the well. His empty eye sockets looked into the well. No one knew what he was waiting for or what he was planning to do. The water vapor in the deep well spread to the courtyard, and the white fog was thick. The surrounding scenery was affected by the fog and suddenly became blurry. The water vapor also seemed to carry a cold aura, and the temperature in the already cold weather suddenly plummeted. "I can't see anything clearly." At this moment, Phoebe cried out in alarm. This is the water curtain formed by the water demon's control of the water yuan qi. "They will attack us under the cover of the water curtain." Han Shuro's calm voice came from the side, calming Phoebe's slightly chaotic heart. Phoebe's eyesight was only at the level of an ordinary person. Even if she cultivated qi, it was only slightly brighter than ordinary people. Compared to a demonic practitioner like Han Shuro who had experienced the cruel training of his body, she was naturally far inferior. Therefore, when her eyesight was obstructed, Han Shuro's pair of starry eyes were not affected at all. In the white fog, there seemed to be silver lightning flashing in Han Shuro's eyes as he calmly surveyed the surroundings. Suddenly, the bubbling water in the deep well burst out like a fountain. These crystal-clear water streams seemed to have a life of their own as they formed strips and entangled Han Shuro and Phoebe. A cold and gloomy aura overflowed from the deep well. Even with the strength of Han Shuro's body, he couldn't help but feel a little cold. The strips formed by the water were between liquid and solid. Like soft eels, they reached out to grab Han Shuro and Phoebe's bodies. "You're courting death." Han Shuro grinned. His smile seemed a little cruel. Red devil flames suddenly appeared in his hands. Like an evil fire that could burn everything, it suddenly stood in front of Han Shuro and Phoebe. As soon as the red devil flames appeared, the surrounding cold aura sizzled and emitted heat waves. The scorching hot aura spread to the surroundings, causing Phoebe's body to immediately feel warm. Hundreds of eel-like strips approached the red devil flames that Han Shuro had set up. Before they could land on the devil flames, they had already melted into water vapor. 2 unpleasant low cries, like the last cries of a drowning person, suddenly came from the deep well. 2 blood-red shadows suddenly shot out from the deep well. The 2 shadows seemed to be formed from blood as they constantly twisted and deformed in the air. Finally, They formed the figures of a man and a woman. However, shadows were still shadows and didn't have real appearances. Blood-water demons. Han Shoror was shocked as he looked at the two blood-red shadows in astonishment. Water demons lived in places of extreme water. If they did evil and killed many living beings, then they would absorb the blood of these living beings. Blood was also a liquid and had the same properties as water. The boiling blood of living beings on the verge of death also had a strange power. Water demons would absorb the power contained in their blood. When the power of the blood absorbed was large enough, water demons could become even more vicious and vicious blood-water demons. After water demons became blood-water demons, not only could they control the power of water origin energy in places of extreme water, but they could also control the blood of living beings with flesh and blood. They were very difficult to deal with. Therefore, when Han Shoror saw that there were already two blood-water demons in front of him, he was immediately very surprised. Blood-water demons were different from other bloodthirsty monsters. Because they had water power to wash them, they could often cover up their own smell of blood. This was also why Han Shoror's sensitive nose couldn't smell a trace of blood when he came close. The two blood-water demons came out of the deep well. Their blood shadows twisted in the air and covered Han Shoror and Phoebe like two blood clouds. Evil power suddenly filled Han Shoror and Phoebe. In an instant, Han Shoror felt the blood in his body boil as if he couldn't control it. Turning around, Han Shoror found that Phoebe was in an even worse state. 2 lines of blood were already flowing out of her nostrils, and her pretty face looked extremely wretched. Cursing inwardly, Han Shoror grabbed Phoebe and threw her outside with all his strength, shouting at the same time, "Leave this courtyard." Regardless of whether Phoebe agreed or not, her body had already been thrown out by Han Shoror. As a sword master, Phoebe had extraordinary strength. Han Shoror wasn't worried that she'd be injured from the fall. But facing 2 blood-water demons here, she likely wouldn't even have the chance to attack before dying from the loss of blood. The blood in his body started flowing uncontrollably towards his orifices. Han Shoror first brought out the Demon Slayer Edge against the blood-water demons, but the Demon Slayer Edge couldn't do any damage to the 2 blood-water demons at all as it whistled through the air and pierced into their bodies. Cutting water with a knife would make it flow even more. This was an ironclad fact. The blood-water demons' bodies were made of liquid. No matter how sharp the Demon Slayer Edge was, the blood-water demons would easily reform after being cut into pieces and wouldn't be harmed in the slightest. The bodies of the 2 blood-water demons reformed after they'd been severed and continued to move unhurriedly towards Han Shoror. With the characteristics of the blood-water demons, when they covered Han Shoror's body, they could instantly suck away all of Han Shoror's blood and turn Han Shoror into a desiccated corpse. As a demonic cultivator, the power contained within Han Shoror's blood wasn't something that an ordinary person or any other strong practitioner in this world could compare to. The 2 blood-water demons seemed to have sensed this as well and treated Han Shoror as a great tonic. They didn't care about Phoebe's departure at all. They didn't separate one blood-water demon to deal with Phoebe and instead focused on Han Shoror. This was an obvious indication of how much they valued Han Shoror. The blood in his body was in a frenzy as the magical yuan was doing its best to control the flow of blood out of his body. As his blood surged, the 2 forces restrained Han Shoror's body, making it hard for Han Shoror to move. However, the power of demonic yuan was also reflected at this moment. As a sword master, Phoebe was already bleeding profusely without any resistance. However, Han Shoror was able to use his demonic yuan to forcefully stop the blood from flowing out of his body. Although it was a bit difficult to resist, not a single drop of blood had flowed out of Han Shoror's body. The 2 greedy blood-water demons were finally about to reach Han Shoror. Han Shoror couldn't move and couldn't use his demonic yuan, so he could only use necromancy magic. Bone spears, bone arrows, and corpse explosion. Han Shoror released one necromancy magic after another, but the 2 blood-water demons remained completely unharmed. At this moment, Han Shoror suddenly understood that he could only harm the 2 blood-water demons by burning them at high temperatures. It was a pity that all of his magical yuan was being used to stop his blood from flowing out, and he couldn't use the mystical glacial spellfire at all. Damn it, Am I going to die at the hands of 2 blood-water demons? I'm not resigned to this. Forget it, I'll use the mystical glacial spellfire to kill the 2 blood-water demons even if I have to risk losing all of my blood. Now that the demon infant has formed, even if I lose all of my blood and body, I can still be reborn with the help of the demon infant. It'll just be a great blow to my vitality, but it'll be much better than dying now. Han Shoror made up his mind and then made up his mind to kill the 2 blood-water demons even if he had to expend a great deal of his energy. At this moment, a mysterious connection suddenly came from the little skull, as if it could understand Han Shoror's thoughts. The little skull sent out a strand of consciousness, anxiously stopping Han Shoror's actions. There were no precise words, but the message was for Han Shoror to stop. Han Shoror could clearly feel it. Han Shoror, who'd been about to make a move, was momentarily stunned as his mind raced. The 2 blood-water demons were only 5 or 6 meters away from Han Shoror. Han Shoror couldn't move and could only look forward, but he couldn't see any trace of the little skull. If he didn't make a move now, Han Shoror could be covered by the 2 blood-water demons at any moment. All of his blood would be sucked dry in the blink of an eye, and his body would instantly lose all signs of life. The demon infant would likely be unable to escape the hands of the 2 blood-water demons even if it left his body. His entire body and soul would be destroyed without a trace. The little skull's anxiousness made Han Shoror unsure if he should stop his plans. Seeing the 2 blood-water demons gradually approach, Han Shoror sighed and made a decision that he didn't know was right or wrong. Trust him. A resolute look appeared in his starry eyes as Han Shoror threw all of his previous plans to the back of his mind. Han Shoror stood where he was and didn't take any action. He simply waited for the little skull's next move and gambled with his life. When the 2 blood-water demons finally covered him, Han Shoror could no longer restrain the blood that he'd been controlling with his magical yuan. It surged out of his orifices like a tide. A deep sense of despair suddenly filled Han Shoror's heart. However, Han Shoror didn't feel any resentment towards the little skull. On the contrary, he felt that he trusted the little skull. There was nothing to regret even if he died this time. Suddenly, Han Shoror's rapidly flowing blood came to a sudden stop, as if the brakes had been slammed on. The mysterious power that controlled his blood also vanished in an instant. Han Shoror's magical yuan once again flowed unimpeded through his body, and his uncontrollable blood flow returned to normal. The 2 blood-water demons in front of him, their featureless bodies, twisted and turned violently in front of his eyes. Han Shoror could tell from the violent twisting and struggling of the 2 blood shadows that they were trying to express their emotions, fear. After the power that controlled his blood had returned to normal, Han Shoror could move freely again. He raised his head and saw that the 2 blood shadows had been pierced by a few bone spikes. The little skull was looking at him with one of his empty eye sockets. He was crouching slightly, his 2 leg bones resting on the 2 blood-water demons. 7 long bone spikes were deeply embedded in the bodies of the 2 blood-water demons. Streaks of bloody light flowed down the 7 bone spikes like liquid and rapidly into the little skull's body. The 7 somewhat blunt bone spikes emitted a bewitching, cold red light. The broken bones in front of the little skull's chest rearranged themselves at a speed visible to Han Shoror's naked eye, also flashing with a bloody red light. On the contrary, the 2 blood-water demons that had been glowing with blood suddenly became dull and lifeless. All of the bewitching blood-red color seemed to be sucked in by the 7 bone spikes as they surged madly towards where the bone spikes were inserted. The blood-water demons of the 2 blood shadows gradually turned pale. Han Shoror could feel that the water energy that the 2 blood-water demons had absorbed for who knew how many years, along with the power of the blood of living beings, was rapidly flowing into the little skull's body. This state didn't last long. When the blood-water demons completely turned pale, there was a splash as their bodies turned into 2 puddles of water and splashed onto the ground. In an instant, the water vapor that had been shrouding the courtyard was blown away by a cold wind and completely disappeared. The afterglow was like blood as it shone down from the sky, giving the courtyard a bleak sense of beauty. Plop! The little skull that had been relying on the 2 blood-water demons to stay in the air lost its footing and fell down due to the dissipation of the 2 blood-water demons. The little skull reached out its hand and scratched its smooth skull. The hollow eyes of the little skull met Han Shoro's eyes, and a sense of joy suddenly spread from the little skull's body into Han Shoro's heart. Every bone on the little skeleton, which was originally as beautiful as fresh blood, was now flowing with a bright red brilliance. After a short while, the little skeleton's bones actually changed again, and finally became as white as jade. Ever since the little skull had been summoned by Han Shoro, his entire skeleton had turned black and blood red due to the refinement of demonic arts. He hadn't expected it to change back to its original color. However, the bones on the little skull's body were now obviously different from the white color of normal skeletal warriors. His bones were translucent and as white as jade, and seemed to sparkle with a dazzling light under the sunlight. This made Han Shoro feel a bit baffled. It was only now that Han Shoro finally understood why the little skull had stopped in front of the shop and refused to leave. He must have been attracted by the bloodwater demons. Han Shoro remembered the last time he was at Bob Asher's slave farm in Valin City. The necromancer Clarendon of the Calamity Church had used blood to summon the three-eyed evil god. In the end, all the blood in the altar had been absorbed by the little skull. Perhaps it was because of this that the smell of blood on the bloodwater demons could be hidden from Han Shoro, but not from the little skull. This was why the little skull had entered the shop of his own accord. As Han Shoro was deep in thought, a strand of divine sense once again came from the little skull. This time, the little skull actually strongly requested to return to the other dimension, and Han Shoro could feel his surging fighting spirit for revenge. After absorbing the power of the two bloodwater demons, the little skull had obviously changed. Not only had all the injuries from the fierce battle recovered, but it also seemed to have gained some other miraculous abilities, which was why he was so full of confidence. The little skull's fighting spirit and demands were very strong. Han Shoro hesitated for a moment, thinking that it shouldn't be a problem if he was more careful in sensing it in the future. Thus, he used necromancy spells to send the little skull back to another mysterious plane. Chapter 195. The afterglow of the setting sun spilled into the courtyard. Apart from two puddles of water, there were no other traces of the well. The sound of hurried footsteps suddenly sounded from outside, quickly approaching. In the blink of an eye, a group of more than 10 people, including Phoebe, appeared in front of Han Shoro. Her beautiful face was filled with worry as her bright eyes suddenly fell on Han Shoro. Seeing that Han Shoro was unharmed, her expression visibly relaxed, but she still didn't relax her grip on the longsword in her hand. Her fair neck turned to survey the surroundings, as if she wanted to see if there were any hidden dangers. Apart from Phoebe, there were 12 other Cairo mercenary band guards in full armor. It looked like they had been summoned by Phoebe. These 12 guards had vigilant looks in their eyes, looking around very cautiously. "Are you all right?" After looking around and seeing that there was nothing out of the ordinary and that there was no danger, Phoebe let out a small breath of air and walked towards Han Shoro to ask. Shaking his head, Han Shoro gave Phoebe a surreptitious look before smiling and comforting her. "Don't worry, I'm fine." "I'm sorry, Mr. Harris, I think we must have been hallucinating. The danger that I spoke of earlier didn't appear." Receiving Han Shoro's look, Phoebe understood that Han Shoro must have taken care of the matter. An embarrassed expression appeared on her pretty face as she spoke to the cold-looking leader of the guards. This man was broad and robust, with a head of short brown hair that was messy. He held a double-edged battle axe in his right hand, and his body gave off the fierce aura of someone who had gone through a lot of killing. It was obvious that he had killed too many people. This shop was once cursed by an evil god. Every owner who has taken over this shop over the years has died a horrible death. Whether human or beast, as long as they accidentally enter this shop, they will be killed by the evil god's curse. There has never been an exception. No matter how you came in, I advise you to leave immediately. Harris' eyes roamed over Han Shoro and Phoebe as he finally spoke coldly. He waved his hand and didn't wait for Han Shoro and Phoebe to say anything. A group of 12 Cairo mercenary band guards walked out of the courtyard with him, as if they didn't want to stay a moment longer. This Harris is a battle-hardened berserker and the vice-captain of the Cairo mercenary band. When I said that there was danger here, he came over reluctantly. It looks like there's something here that makes people wary. Even with my strength as a sword master, I didn't have any ability to resist. Phoebe briefly introduced Harris' identity after he left and then changed the topic. She stared at Hanshaw and said, "What's going on?" Smiling dashingly, Hanshaw reached out to touch the well and said happily, "The 2 Bloodwater demons have been killed. There won't be any more strange occurrences happening here in the future. In addition, I'm going to buy this shop no matter how much gold I have to spend." With a face full of pleasant surprise, Phoebe looked at Hanshaw with bright eyes and said confidently, "Since you've said this, you must have enough confidence. Don't worry about the shop, I'll be in charge of negotiating with the Cairo mercenary band. I think a cursed place like this won't be worth much gold." Nodding, Hanshaw walked to Phoebe's side and reached out to hug Phoebe. He moved his mouth close to her ear and said softly, "Phoebe, thank you so much." Suddenly blushing, Phoebe hugged Hanshaw back and kissed Hanshaw lightly on the lips. She then put some distance between the two and looked directly at Hanshaw, saying emotionally, "You were the first to throw me out when danger approached. Brian, I should be the one thanking you." Not only had the danger of the Bloodwater demons caused Phoebe to experience life and death, even Hanshaw had almost been scared out of his wits. After the great calamity, the two looked at each other and both felt a sense of appreciation for what they had now. Under the light of the setting sun, Phoebe's beautiful face looked even more beautiful. Her bright eyes sparkled with light, making Hanshaw want to lose himself in them. Tightening his grip, Hanshaw pulled Phoebe into his arms. Feeling Phoebe's body tremble slightly in close contact, Hanshaw's heart was filled with happiness. Before he'd come to this world, Hanshaw had been an ordinary person with evil intentions but no guts. His personality was kind but a bit cowardly. He hadn't done anything to be proud of in his 20 years of life, nor had he ever had a woman. He'd lived in mediocrity for 20 years. But under Chu Kanglan's scheme, he'd brought the memories of the demonic arts to this strange world. In a short period of time, Hanshaw had obtained great power, obtained a considerable sum of money, and had already won the hearts of 2 stunning beauties. The vicissitudes of life were always so unexpected. The extravagant hope that he'd only dared to imagine 20 years ago was quickly realized in such a short amount of time. This caused a feeling of disbelief to rise in Hanshaw's heart. Sometimes, Hanshaw even felt that everything that was happening now was like an unreal dream. However, the repeated dangers and pain reminded him that this wasn't an illusion. "All right, I think Emily must still be waiting for us. Let's hurry over." Sighing with emotion, Hanshaw couldn't help but speak softly to Phoebe as he watched the sunset glow fade away. The sky had already darkened. Seeming to greatly enjoy this moment of peace and tenderness, Phoebe gave a light and gently allowed Hanshaw to hold her soft little hand. The two walked shoulder to shoulder towards the location they'd agreed upon with Emily. Before long, Hanshaw and Phoebe appeared in front of the shop. Because the sky was already dark, there weren't any customers inside. When Hanshaw had just walked inside, a hale and hearty old man chuckled and asked, "Are you Lord Brian?" "I wouldn't dare call you Lord. You can just call me Brian." Hanshaw humbly bowed towards the old man and took out his dark mantle identity medallion, handing it to the old man with both hands. The old man took Hanshaw's iron medallion and glanced at it, returning it to Hanshaw with a smile. He then said a bit apologetically to Phoebe, "I'm sorry, Miss Phoebe, please wait here for a moment. The Dark Mantle has its rules. Apart from internal personnel, outsiders are not allowed inside." As the Hand of Darkness of Lancelot Empire, the Dark Mantle naturally had rules that everyone had to abide by. As an outsider, Phoebe being able to come together with Hanshaw was already an exception. Naturally, Phoebe couldn't be allowed inside. Phoebe didn't maintain her usual cold arrogance towards such a polite and amiable old man. She smiled and nodded, casually sitting down outside. "Let's go, I'll take you inside." The old man bowed slightly and led Hanshaw inside. After passing through a corridor, the old man stopped in front of the living room and pointed inside, saying, "Lord Emily is inside." As Hanshaw walked inside, the old man returned the way he'd come. It looked like he'd gone outside to continue looking after the shop. Is that Brian? Emily's voice suddenly sounded out of nowhere as soon as Hanshaw set foot in the living room. A large hole then automatically split open in the middle of the living room. It was similar to what Hanshaw and Emily had seen last time in Bob Asher's room in Valin City. After the hole opened up, Emily, who had changed into a lighter outfit, walked out slowly. There was a fireplace next to the living room and the temperature inside was quite moderate. Therefore, Emily didn't continue to wrap herself up tightly. How is it? Is everything done? Hanshaw walked towards Emily and asked with a smile after the hole had healed. There's no problem. My brother will take over immediately. We've successfully completed this mission. Hihi, do you want to know how much you've contributed this time? Emily's beautiful face had a trace of mischievousness as she looked at Hanshaw with sparkling eyes. Emily's appearance was mature with a few traces of youthful naughtiness, giving her a seductive charm. Hanshaw's heart skipped a beat as his hands reached out dishonestly and pulled Emily, who was sitting on the other chair, into his broad chest. His hands roamed dishonestly over Emily's alluring and mature body as he chuckled, "Little hussy, I haven't settled the score with you for causing trouble in the tree hole earlier." Humph. Raising her head, Emily glared at Hanshaw and said with a huff, "You still dare mention that matter? You actually dared to flirt with Phoebe in front of me in the dark. Do you even put me in your eyes? Don't think that I can't see because it's dark inside." Humph. Phoebe's panting was so loud and you guys still dared to pretend to be serious. He abruptly lifted Emily's legs and Emily, who had originally been in his arms, suddenly knelt on top of Hanshaw's thighs. Her round and plump buttocks stuck up high. As Emily cried out in alarm, Hanshaw's large hands landed on Emily's full and perky buttocks with a pa-pa sound, causing Emily to beg for mercy under the pain. All right, I won't bother with you anymore, you big bastard." Emily cooperatively begged for mercy and suddenly said, "After this mission, you've gone from 3rd star to 1st moon. You've jumped a few ranks again." Hanshaw was startled and then stopped his messy movements. He looked at Emily in confusion. Sometimes, completing a few missions doesn't guarantee one's advancement by 1 star. Why did I jump so many ranks after completing just 1 mission? Did you pull some strings for me? Rolling her eyes at Hanshaw, Emily was exasperated and amused at the same time. You should know that you're dealing with Bob Asher of the Griffin Legion. The difficulty of this kind of mission is completely different from gathering information and capturing 1 or 2 escaped nobles. Based on your contributions this time, it wouldn't be too much to promote you to 1st moon. It's just that you've only joined the Dark Mantle for less than half a year. It's too shocking that you've already become a 1st moon, so we didn't give you the status of 2nd moon. Hanshaw thought for a bit and understood after hearing Emily's words. He then remembered Chester's matter and said to Emily, "Right, Chester should still be in the Dark Mantle in Valin City. What kind of treatment did he receive? Thanks to you, he was promoted to a rank 4 envoy. That kid sure is smart. He was just passing on a message, and he got such a good treatment. Even when I was doing missions back then, I didn't get such a good deal." Emily replied with a smile. "Oh right, when will Elaine and Belinda get here?" Hanshaw couldn't help but secretly rejoice for Chester when he heard that he'd received a reward as well. He then suddenly thought of Elaine and Belinda and couldn't help but ask, "I almost forgot if you didn't mention it. Belinda is an unexpected gain. If we send her to the Dark Mantle headquarters and interrogate the torture experts there, we'll be able to learn a lot about the Calamity Church. When the time comes, according to the value of the information from her mouth, we will be able to receive additional reward." Emily giggled as she spoke joyfully. "Oh right, after advancing from a 3-star dark star to a 1-month dark moon, what kind of treatment can I enjoy?" Hanshaw thought for a bit and immediately asked. This was what he should be most concerned about at the moment. First, the amount of gold coins you receive every month will increase from 70 to 150. Of course, I don't think you'll care about these gold coins. Apart from this, you can use your current authority to obtain all kinds of information on the corresponding identities in every Dark Mantle stronghold. You can now use all the transportation matrices in every city of the Lancelot Empire without paying any gold coins. You can use your current status in any military organization in every city to mobilize no more than 100 soldiers to assist you in battle under special circumstances. Also, Han Shoror finally discovered after Emily's tireless explanation that all aspects of treatment had greatly improved after advancing from Dark Star to Dark Moon. The Dark Moon envoys already had so many privileges. The higher-ranked Dark Sun envoys and the 3 heavyweights of the Dark Mantle naturally enjoyed even more privileges. No wonder so many people wished to grasp power. It looked like this was indeed a good thing. Han Shoror couldn't help but sigh emotionally. Chapter 196. The Dark Mantle's secret stronghold definitely couldn't allow Phoebe to stay. Now that the relationship between Han Shoror and Phoebe was clear, he naturally needed to be with her. After feeding Emily and comforting her with a few words, Han Shoror and Phoebe finally left the place together, planning on finding their own hotel to stay in. Sunny Tanai had the most inns of all sizes. Because the majority of merchants and adventurers came and went, the various entertainment facilities weren't any less than in droll. Along the way, bright purple and red lights shone from the taverns onto the streets. Young girls dressed in either garish or pure attire stood on the streets, throwing flirtatious glances at passers-by with enchanting smiles and coaxing passers-by to enter. Han Shoror and Phoebe walked shoulder to shoulder, their eyes looking straight ahead, much to Phoebe's satisfaction. In actuality, this was because Han Shoror had just vented on Emily's well-rounded body. He naturally didn't have any nefarious thoughts when he came out immediately. After a while, Phoebe stopped in front of a luxuriously decorated hotel. She pulled Han Shoror with a small hand and led Han Shoror inside. When they arrived at the counter, the skinny owner smiled fawningly before Phoebe could open her mouth and said fawningly, "Honored Miss Phoebe, will you still choose that room this time?" Nodding her head, Phoebe's expression was cool as she took out her crystal card and handed it over, not saying anything else. From the owner's expression, Han Shoror knew that this definitely wasn't Phoebe's first time here. It looked like Phoebe must have visited many places in her travels to and fro with the Boot Merchant Guild. Taking out the crystal card and key, Phoebe turned her head and smiled faintly at Han Shoror. She grabbed Han Shoror's arm and walked inside. The interior of the hotel was comfortably warm, completely incomparable to the cold outside. Brilliant lights were hung along the corridors, illuminating the entire hotel. The solid wood floorboards were as bright as a mirror. Clear footsteps rang out as they stepped on them, the sound exceptionally pleasing to the ear. It looked like these floorboards were obviously not ordinary. Han Shoror hadn't noticed that Phoebe had arranged another room for him as he walked with Phoebe. He couldn't help but feel a bit of ambiguous anticipation as they walked deeper into the corridors. Could it be that Phoebe was planning on sharing a bed with him? As he thought of this, Han Shoror's eyes couldn't help but look at Phoebe beside him with a fiery gaze. All he saw was Phoebe's long brown hair cascading down naturally like a waterfall. As she walked, her hair fluttered gracefully over her fair cheeks and slender neck. Her eyebrows were curved like crescent moons, her skin was creamy, her eyes were bright like stars, and her lips were as red as a cherry dripping with water. It made one want to fiercely bite them. Big pervert, what are you looking at? Suddenly, Phoebe stopped in her tracks and rolled her eyes at Han Shoror with a slightly red face. Han Shoror's fiery gaze carried a strong desire to possess her. Phoebe wasn't a fool and naturally saw it clearly. She couldn't help but rebuke him in her panic. No, nothing. Han Shoror straightened his expression and immediately concealed his lecherous gaze. He changed the topic and said, "Why aren't you walking? We're here. What are you thinking about? Can't you see the door is right in front of us?" Phoebe's bright eyes were filled with shyness and joy. She glared at Han Shoror and pointed at the door. Sure enough, he followed Phoebe's jade finger and discovered a tightly shut door. The corridor had also reached the end. It seemed that this should be the most secluded room. "Nothing, I was just thinking about you." Han Shoror laughed evilly and raised his head to look directly at Phoebe. "You stinking bastard, You only know how to use flowery words to coax me. Phoebe felt a sweetness in her heart as she shouted in a soft voice. No, I was indeed thinking about you just now, Hanshaw said, feeling wronged. Phoebe naturally wouldn't believe him. She flicked a glance at Hanshaw and said with a light snort, then you definitely weren't thinking in a good way. Look at your lecherous smile earlier. You must be thinking of some dirty thoughts. He really hadn't been thinking of anything good before. Phoebe had guessed correctly and Hanshaw could only laugh dryly. He then urged Phoebe, hurry up and open the door. I'm very tired after a busy day. Let's go in early to wash up and sleep. Phoebe didn't pursue the matter and took out the key to open the door. She moved to the side to let Hanshaw in and then locked the door from the back. There was a spacious hall in front of them with a soft carpet and large fur chairs. There were 4 rooms that had already been booked, including 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a storage room for miscellaneous clothes. Do you think I don't know what you're thinking? Humph, there are 2 rooms here, one for each of us. If anyone dares to barge in the middle of the night, I'll stab him with my sword. Phoebe raised her head threateningly as she lit up the fireplace, causing the temperature in the room to slowly rise. Heh, I'm just afraid that someone who dares barge in will run into a beautiful woman's wet dreams and then take the initiative to throw himself into her arms. Hanshaw laughed evilly and exposed her. You damned bastard, you still dare mention this matter. Phoebe's face instantly flushed red as she flew in front of Hanshaw in a rage. Her slender, jade hands reached out and pinched the tender flesh on Hanshaw's waist. Hanshaw first cooperated with her by letting out a miserable shriek, then grabbed Phoebe in his arms and pressed his mouth against hers without the slightest trace of politeness. Amidst Phoebe's unrelenting whimpers, Hanshaw's tongue was like a dragon entering the ocean, wantonly swirling about. Phoebe symbolically struggled for a while before her delicate body gradually softened. Her jade hands that were originally pounding on Hanshaw's chest had unknowingly wrapped around Hanshaw's neck like a snake. Her small fragrant tongue secretly stuck out and entangled with Hanshaw's. Conveniently lying down on the soft carpet below, Hanshaw savored Phoebe's fragrant sweetness while reaching out to caress Phoebe's perky breasts. When Hanshaw's large hands finally covered Phoebe's soft breasts, Phoebe suddenly struggled and abruptly pushed Hanshaw away from her body. She then rolled her eyes at Hanshaw with a blushing face and said with seductive eyes, "It looks like I must be careful. Otherwise, if I'm not careful, you'll take all the advantages. Oh, after running around for such a long time, my body is about to stink. I need to take a quick shower, you just stay here obediently." As soon as she finished speaking, Phoebe rushed into the dressing room as if she was fleeing and slammed the door shut with a bang. Then, the sound of running water could be heard from inside. It looked like Phoebe was indeed in a hurry to wash off the dirt on her body. Dong dong dong. Dong dong dong. It was at this time that there was a sudden knock on the door. Hanshaw was startled and thought to himself that it couldn't be Emily who had come looking for him, could it? Walking towards the door with suspicion, Hanshaw opened the door and saw a large cluster of beautiful flowers. There were probably no less than 100 of them and they exuded a delicate fragrance that gladdened the heart and refreshed the mind. Suddenly, the large cluster of flowers was removed and a handsome face appeared in front of Hanshaw. His eyebrows were like swords and his eyes were like stars. He had a wide forehead and a high nose bridge. Apart from his cheeks being a bit thin, this face could be called extraordinarily handsome. The handsome face that originally had a brilliant smile on it suddenly furrowed his eyebrows and was covered by a haze. He looked at Hanshaw with an unfriendly expression and said, "Who are you? Where's Phoebe? She's bathing inside, and who are you?" Hanshaw was stunned at first, but then he suddenly reacted. This person must be Phoebe's admirer and asked with an equally displeased expression, "Bathing? Then what are you doing here?" The person's face grew even uglier when he heard that Phoebe was bathing inside and Hanshaw was in this room. He suddenly cried out in surprise, "Oh, nothing much. I'm also staying here. If you don't have anything important, please don't disturb our rest." Hanshaw's expression was cold as he flicked a glance at the person and said unhappily, "I'm the captain of the Rainbow Sickle Mercenary Band, Florida. I'm Phoebe's good friend. Of course I have business with her, please don't block me. He glared angrily at Han Shoror and almost roared lowly as a magical ripple emanated from his body. Han Shoror was startled when he heard that this person was called Florida and the captain of the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band. He looked at this person with an additional trace of vigilance. Just like the Cairo mercenary band, the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band was also a very famous power in the Valley of Sunshine. However, most of the members were from the Lancelot Empire. A few years ago, the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band was the strongest in the Valley of Sunshine and had once been in charge of order here. However, the original leader of the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band had met with misfortune during a battle against bandits, causing their decline. Florida was the current captain of the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band. Ever since he'd taken charge of the band 2 years ago, he'd made it flourish with each passing day. The greatly weakened Rainbow Sickle mercenary band had been revitalized in his hands, and it was said that they were now the Cairo mercenary band's greatest competitor. It was rumored that this person was a light archmage and seemed to have some connection to the Church of Light. His own strength was unfathomable and he was a straightforward person, but he was decisive when it came to killing. He never showed mercy to his enemies and had great prestige within the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band. Who would have thought that such a person would be an admirer of Phoebe? When Han Shoror learned of this person's identity, although he felt a bit of a headache, he wasn't afraid. He said coldly, "I'm sorry, I'm Phoebe's boyfriend. It's not convenient for Phoebe to see you at this time, please come again next time." Han Shoror snorted coldly after speaking and slammed the door shut with a bang. Chapter 197. Florida was more domineering than Han Shoror had imagined. He'd already sensed a dangerous magical pulse in the instant that Han Shoror's door had closed. Han Shoror's heart jumped in fright as he immediately took a step back. An explosive crack rang out as the room exploded into a ball of white light. Large pieces of wood flew into the air as Florida's handsome face once again appeared in front of Han Shoror. He was still tightly clutching a bouquet of flowers in his left hand, but in his right hand was a staff embedded with red, yellow, and blue crystals, emanating strong magical pulses. "I said that I wanted to see Phoebe, didn't you hear me?" Florida looked at Han Shoror with a cold expression as he spat out each word viciously. Florida was about the same age as the deceased clerk, around 26 or 27 years old. The two had many similarities, and both had great strength and handsome looks. However, although Clark's thoughts were vicious, he wouldn't display it so domineeringly. At least he understood that his status was noble and knew how to hide his emotions before making a move behind his back. This Florida, however, looked like a lawless person. His actions were even more brash and unbridled, as if he had no scruples. "I've also said that please don't disturb our rest." Han Shoror snorted coldly as his body closed in on Florida like lightning. He gathered magical yuan into a fist and punched straight at Florida's handsome face. Han Shoror's sudden move was obviously out of Florida's expectations. Panic immediately appeared on his face as he threw out the bouquet of flowers in his left hand, his body retreating rapidly at the same time. The punch that had gathered magical yuan caused the wind to howl as it pulverized the bouquet of flowers. The petals danced in the air as a sweet fragrance permeated the air. When the punch was about to land on Florida's handsome face, a strong magical pulse suddenly emanated from Florida's body. A brilliant, glazed magic shield suddenly enveloped Florida like an enormous light bulb. Bam! Han Shoror's fist smashed into the magic shield and felt as if he'd punched a soft cotton ball. The magic shield twisted at the point of impact from Han Shoror's punch, and a deep fist imprint appeared. Han Shoror's tightly clenched fist stopped in front of Florida's high-nose bridge, unable to move any further. With a few thumping sounds, Florida turned pale with fright and retreated a few steps with his magic shield, increasing the distance between him and Han Shoror. His breathing was a bit erratic, and his gaze towards Han Shoror became even colder, as if Han Shoror had become his mortal enemy. "You dare make the first move?" Florida's voice was as savage as his appearance as he glared angrily at Han Shoror. Han Shoror waved his outstretched fist and retracted it. Han Shoror pointed at the shattered door and said callously, "Your actions can be considered an invasion from the moment you broke the door." "I was only defending myself." Nodding with a cold smile, Florida looked coldly at Han Shoror and said, "Very good, you've got some guts. However, now that we've pulled apart, you won't have the chance to approach me again. Now let me see just how much skill you have." Florida took another few steps back after he'd spoken and raised the magic staff in his right hand, intending to officially fight Han Shoror. Han Shoror also solemnly took out the Demon Slayer edge from his space ring when he saw Florida's actions, preparing to deal with Florida's attack. This person was a light archmage and his strength was certainly out of the ordinary. Han Shoror had tested him just now and discovered that Florida's reactions and movements were nimble. It looked like he was an expert who'd gone through hundreds of battles. Han Shoror hadn't been able to hurt Florida when the two had been so close before. Now that there was some distance between them, Florida would be able to make use of his strengths as a mage and would definitely be difficult to deal with. At this moment, hurried footsteps rapidly approached from the distance. Just as Han Shoror and Florida were about to make their move, Vice Chief Harris of the Cairo mercenary band, who they'd met in the shop in the place of extreme water, quickly approached with a few guards. "Isn't this Chief Florida? Why aren't you staying with the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band? Why are you causing trouble in the property protected by the Cairo mercenary band?" Harris' voice was full of faint mockery and was as cold as it had been during the day. The sound of water splashing in the washroom suddenly stopped at this moment. It looked like Phoebe, whose hearing had been affected by the sound of water in the shower, had finally discovered the commotion outside after all the noise just now. Florida, who had been hostile towards Han Shoror, turned his head to look at Harris when he heard Harris' voice. He put away the magic staff in his hand and said with a cold expression, "I'm here to see Miss Phoebe. I hadn't thought that I'd be blocked outside by a blind brat. If you're here to manage the hotel's business, then I welcome you on behalf of the owner. However, I hope that you don't try to make a move here or our Cairo mercenary band will definitely intervene. You've stayed in the glorious Sun Tanai for so long, you must know the rules of the glorious Sun Tanai." Harris snorted coldly when he saw Florida put away his magic staff. "Mph, count yourself lucky today," Florida said coldly to Han Shoror and then turned to walk out. He stopped next to Harris and said with his back to Han Shoror, "I'll regain control of the Valley of Sunshine before long. I won't be as polite to you then." Florida laughed wildly after he'd finished speaking and walked out with large strides. He actually didn't stay here and wait for Phoebe to come out. Harris' face was ugly as the veins on his forehead bulged. He looked like he'd go berserk at any moment. Han Shoror knew that Harris was a berserker. It was said that a berserker's strength was quite astonishing to begin with, and they could also use a mysterious method to go berserk. Their strength would continue to increase explosively after going berserk, and they possessed unbelievable destructive power. Seeing Harris' current appearance, Han Shoror really hoped that he'd suddenly go berserk and be unable to suppress the rage in his heart, immediately attacking Florida to the death. It was a pity that Harris quickly returned to normal after his initial rage and didn't fulfill Han Shoror's wishes. He flicked a cold glance at Han Shoror and said, "You'll have to compensate for the door here. Florida has great power in the Valley of Sunshine, so be careful since you've offended him. You can come find us if you need anything from the Cairo mercenary band." Although his expression was still cold, perhaps because they had a common enemy, Harris' attitude towards Han Shoror had changed a bit. There was even a hint of concern in his words. Han Shoror hadn't planned on compensating for the door because it was Florida who'd damaged it. However, Harris' attitude had changed now, and Han Shoror also needed to obtain the shop with the place of extreme water through the Cairo mercenary band. Therefore, he smiled readily and said, "No problem." Nodding his head, Harris didn't say anything else. He waved his hand and left with his guards. The washroom door creaked open after Harris left and Phoebe walked out in a bathrobe like a lotus flower emerging from the water. Her long, wet hair hung loosely over her shoulders, revealing a small patch of rosy white skin. Her red lips were moist and full as she quickly glanced at the door. She exhaled lightly and said to Han Shuro, "They've all left. They've all left. What's with that Florida?" Han Shuro swept a glance over Phoebe and asked with an unhappy expression. Chuckling lowly, Phoebe pulled up her bathrobe and wrapped it tightly around her slender body. She walked to Han Shuro's side and blinked her wet eyelashes as she looked at Han Shuro with interest. She said teasingly, "What, jealous?" "Yes, I'm jealous. That brat looks all high and mighty and even brought a bunch of fresh flowers to look for you. He even dared to ask me, his boyfriend, to move out of the way. I'm not in a good mood right now." Han Shuro was quite frank as he looked directly at Phoebe and spoke with displeasure. Her body softened as Phoebe sat directly on Han Shuro's lap and giggled softly before explaining, "I often come to the Valley of Sunshine and have done business with the Rainbow Sickle Mercenary Band. However, he's always pursued me and I don't have any relationship with him." "Heh, all right, don't be angry. I'll explain things clearly to him next time I see him and tell him to stop bothering me in the future. Is that okay? There's no point in explaining. I don't think this brat is the magnanimous type. I didn't like him from the first time I saw him, but I think he feels the same way about me. I think the grudge between us has been sown." Han Shuro shook his head and said to Phoebe, "Then what do we do? The Rainbow Sickle Mercenary Band is quite powerful in the Valley of Sunshine and is only second to the Cairo Mercenary Band. It's said that the Rainbow Sickle Mercenary Band has been recruiting even more recently. Through some unknown method, they've even invited a group of experts from the Church of Light. They seem to want to replace the Cairo Mercenary Band's position in the Valley of Sunshine. It'll be very troublesome if Tanai offends them in the Valley of Sunshine." Phoebe was startled and said with a bit of worry, "We'll deal with it as it comes. He's not the only one in the Valley of Sunshine right now. I don't believe he can do anything to me." Han Shuro snorted coldly and said fearlessly. Chapter 198. Florida's appearance had caused the door to shatter. The two of them had no choice but to switch rooms and pay 20 gold coins for the damaged door. This time, Phoebe had asked for 2 rooms, so Han Shuro no longer had the opportunity to steal her beauty. When Phoebe returned to her room to rest, Han Shuro didn't remain idle either. Han Shuro found the cupboard in this room and set up the transportation matrix. He then adjusted his mental strength and released a dark mist spell in the cupboard before walking into the transportation matrix. The cemetery of death was as cold and desolate as ever. When Han Shuro walked out, he saw that the enormous Gilbert had revealed his true form and was sleeping amidst the pure white bones. He didn't notice Han Shuro's arrival at all. After 2 days of rushing about, Gilbert had shouldered a heavy responsibility. His body had once again been injured and should be truly tired. Han Shuro didn't disturb him and went to the place where the Earth Elite Zombie and Yin demons were being refined. First, Han Shuro channeled magical Yuan into the Yin demon cave. When Han Shuro discovered that there were only 9 wraiths left in the Yin demon cave and that they were still fighting each other day and night, he understood that the day of harvesting Yin demons was getting closer and closer. The Earth Elite Zombie in the place of Extreme Earth exuded an enormous aura of life. The Earth Chi that surrounded the entire cemetery of death was becoming thinner and thinner. Clouds of grey aura enveloped the center of the place of Extreme Earth, as if a large hand was gripping it tightly and slowly pulling it in. A mysterious connection came from the center of the place of Extreme Earth. Han Shuro stared blankly for a moment before a wave of joy suddenly surged into his heart. When he carefully sensed it, Han Shuro discovered that this joy came from the Earth Elite Zombie buried deep underground. It seemed that Han Shuro's arrival had made the Earth Elite Zombie feel joy. After absorbing the Earth Chi in the place of Extreme Earth for such a long time, in addition to the nourishment of the precious materials that Han Shuro had spent a huge amount of money to purchase, the Earth Elite Zombie was no longer a simple zombie warrior. He already had the most instinctive senses. Han Shuro had found the 3 places of Extreme Earth, wood, and water. With the help of Phoebe's trading company, Han Shoror was confident that he could purchase enough materials to refine the earth, wood, and water elite zombies. As long as these three types of zombies were formed, the strength of Han Shoror's body would greatly increase. If he could also find the places of extreme metal and fire together, Han Shoror would possess a terrifying demonic formation when he gathered the 5 elemental zombies. When that time came, he would have even more right to speak in this world. Seeing that everything was normal here, Han Shoror didn't wake up Gilbert and silently returned to the inn in the Valley of Sunshine. After climbing onto the bed, Han Shoror sat cross-legged and closed his eyes. His entire body relaxed as he slowly sank into a meditative state, not relaxing at all to increase his mental strength. Phoebe came over early the next morning. Her originally straight hair had been tied up high, and her sky blue dress set off Phoebe's temperament even more elegant. She naturally came over and grabbed Han Shoror's arm. Phoebe pulled Han Shoror outside and said, "Let's go, we'll continue strolling around the Valley of Sunshine today and try to collect all the materials you need." Han Shoror gladly agreed. He'd originally only been collecting materials to refine the wood elite zombie, but because of the discovery of the place of extreme water, Han Shoror had started to prepare the materials he needed to refine the water elite zombie in advance. As the border between the 3 kingdoms, the Valley of Sunshine was filled with an endless stream of merchants. All sorts of strange goods could be found here. When Han Shoror and Phoebe searched patiently, they indeed found quite a few materials they needed. The noon sun shone down on the Valley of Sunshine, bathing the entire valley in sunlight. It was so warm that it made people feel very comfortable. Walking out of a shop, Phoebe rubbed her lower abdomen and smiled sweetly at Han Shoror. "I'm a bit hungry. Let's find a place to get something to eat first. You're familiar with this place. Just take me to where there's delicious food." Han Shoror replied with a smile. It was said that when a demonic arts practitioner reached a certain level, they could live for hundreds of years without eating or drinking. They didn't need to use grains to nourish their body. However, Han Shoror hadn't reached this level yet. Besides, food was also a form of enjoyment for Han Shoror, apart from replenishing his body's energy. Phoebe led the way in front and the two walked into a small shop. A few dwarfs about 1 meter tall walked out and politely welcomed Han Shoror and Phoebe to their seats. This shop wasn't very big, and the decorations inside weren't luxurious either. There were only a few simple chairs, but it was packed with people. A few merchants wearing luxurious fur coats and sparkling diamond rings on their fingers sat lazily on the tables and chairs that weren't very spacious, wolfing down the food on their plates without a care for their image. Han Shoror and Phoebe sat down at a table for 2 by the window. Phoebe didn't ask for Han Shoror's opinion, and directly instructed a dwarf next to her, "Bring the best food in the shop." The dwarf smiled faintly and bowed courteously, then quickly left Phoebe and Han Shoror's side. He was probably busy with something. Dwarfs are really a strange race. Some dwarfs are skilled at forging ironware, some are skilled at brewing fine wine, and some love to cook. When they fall in love with their craft, they can always bring some incredible masterpieces to people. The dwarfs in this shop come from a remote mountain range in Kossi Empire. The joy of their life is to cook all kinds of delicious food. The food made by their hands is simply unforgettable, Phoebe explained to Han Shoror with a smile. Han Shoror, who came from another world, had enjoyed the influence of China's culinary culture. After tasting some of the food in this world, he always felt that the difference between the food here and the extensive and profound culinary culture of China was simply not small at all. To be honest, Han Shoror really didn't believe that the food here would be more exquisite and tasty than what Han Shoror had eaten in hotels before. Therefore, he didn't hold much hope and just smiled in response to Phoebe's words. The business here was very good. From the number of customers and their status, it could be seen that the extravagant customers didn't dislike the small size of this place. In particular, Han Shoror could tell from the way some of the elegant noblewomen ate that they really did enjoy the food on their plates. While Han Shoror and Phoebe were chatting with smiles, the dwarf who had just left carried 2 large plates of strange food and gently placed them in front of Han Shoror and Phoebe. It looked like a strange kind of meat cooked to a glossy color. A strange aroma wafted into Hanshaw's mouth and nose, surprising Hanshaw. On the other side, Phoebe held a knife and fork in front of Hanshaw and had already started chewing. Looking at her appearance, it was obvious that she really enjoyed this kind of food. When Hanshaw tried to cut a piece of meat and put it in his mouth, his brows suddenly relaxed. Then, his mouth was filled with a wonderful feeling, like a kind of mysterious magic. The delicious taste of the food continuously lingered in Hanshaw's heart, mouth, and nose without dissipating. With his appetite greatly awakened, Hanshaw, who had just taken a small bite, immediately began to chew heartily, wolfing down the food on his plate. When his stomach was slightly bloated, Hanshaw burped and praised, "It's really good. No wonder there are so many people trying to squeeze into this small store. Friend, we meet again." At this moment, Florida walked in from the entrance. Florida, wearing a white magic robe, stood in front of the door and looked coldly at Hanshaw. Phoebe, who was still enjoying the food on her plate, raised her head to look at Florida when she heard this. She then waved her hand to call the little dwarf over and threw a bag of gold coins on the table. She stood up and said to Hanshaw, "Let's go out." Hanshaw's expression was indifferent as he waved his hand and said to Phoebe, "I have nothing to talk about with him. Just tell him directly. If he continues to pester me and won't let go, I'll be more than happy to keep him company." After yesterday's exchange, Hanshaw understood that Florida's strength was indeed unfathomable. However, Hanshaw now possessed both magic and necromancy magic. He also had the mysterious little skull, the Earth Elite zombie, and the 3 yin demons on the verge of forming. With all of these strengths added together, Hanshaw wasn't afraid of Florida at all. With his magic rapidly improving every day, Hanshaw didn't need to lower his head in front of anyone. Phoebe started slightly when she heard Hanshaw's words, then smiled sweetly and said, "I understand." Slowly moving, Phoebe got up and walked towards Florida. The smile she'd just shown to Hanshaw was replaced by cold arrogance when facing Florida. When they arrived at the door, Phoebe pointed at Hanshaw and said to Florida, "He's my boyfriend, I think we have nothing to say. Business is business, but you don't have the right to interfere in my life. I hope you won't disturb me in the future." Although he'd long since been mentally prepared, when Florida heard Phoebe's blunt words with his own mouth, he was still momentarily absent-minded. Different from how he treated Hanshaw, when Florida faced Phoebe, the rigid lines on his face became very gentle. Even his voice was abnormally gentle as he stared closely at Phoebe and said, "Where did this brat come from? What can he bring to you? Why did you choose him? Sorry, this matter has nothing to do with you. I hope you take care of yourself." Phoebe's expression was cold as she spoke in an equally cold voice. Nodding, Florida laughed ruefully and looked at Phoebe and Hanshaw in the distance. He said "all right" 3 times in a row, then suddenly turned around and left. "Please, bring another plate of the same food." Hanshaw snorted coldly and then said to the dwarf beside him with a smile. Chapter 199. After filling their stomachs and walking out of the dwarven food store, Phoebe and Hanshaw strolled through all of Glorious Sunshine Tarnai's stores for a while. Phoebe then went to find the Cairo mercenary band to purchase the store with the place of extreme water for Hanshaw. Hanshaw headed to the store that Emily was at alone, planning to find Emily and probe Florida's background. The old man was still standing guard at the door. This store was selling armor for knights from the Lancelot Empire. Because the sky hadn't darkened yet, there were a few people dressed like knights in the hall, shopping for knights' clothing. When the old man saw Hanshaw walk in, he smiled and gestured to Hanshaw, pointing to the courtyard in the back. Hanshaw understood and pretended to pick out the knight's clothing. He walked in through the door that led to the courtyard in the back. "How did you provoke Florida?" When Hanshaw asked Emily with a cold expression on his face, Emily was obviously taken aback and responded with a question of surprise. "Apart from the information that everyone already knows, do you have any other information about him? I know that the Dark Mantle must have information that no one knows about him." Hanshaw looked at Emily and said. Emily's brow furrowed slightly as she looked intently at Hanshaw. Just what is going on? Hanshaw briefly explained what had happened last night to Emily. Emily then said angrily, I've long since heard that this Florida is arrogant and conceited, but who would have thought that he's actually this domineering? The Valley of Sunshine isn't even under the control of the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band now, yet he dares be so arrogant. Hanshaw's somewhat displeased mood suddenly improved a bit when he saw that Emily was also angry. He then said gently, just what is this Florida's background? The glorious Sun Tanai is a dark mantle stronghold. Their main mission is to collect the materials here. Florida isn't from our Lancelot Empire, nor is he from Kossi Empire. He comes from a vassal state of our Lancelot Empire. His grandfather is Grand Magus Ferguson of the Church of Light. His status in the Church of Light is very high, and it's said that he has great hopes of becoming a sacred magus. Florida grew up in the Church of Light and was personally taught magic by his grandfather. In addition to light magic, he also studied lightning magic. This was a secret that most people didn't know. With his grandfather's guidance and his own extraordinary talent, he had become an archmage 3 years ago at such a young age. The Dark Mantle had once paid close attention to him, believing that he would become one of the super experts on the continent in the future. However, Florida didn't join the Church of Light. He suddenly left the church a few years ago and went to the Valley of Sunshine, joining the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band. Because of his great strength, he'd won the trust of the leader of the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band, Jason, in an extremely short amount of time. Jason had even entrusted his only daughter to him, but during a battle against bandits, old Jason had accidentally died in battle, and his daughter had also gone missing. It's said that this matter seemed to have something to do with Florida, but no one had any evidence to prove this. After Jason's death, Florida naturally took control of the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band. Unfortunately, because some people suspected that this matter had something to do with Florida, some core members angrily withdrew from the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band and the Valley of Sunshine, allowing the Cairo mercenary band to grow. However, the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band has indeed developed quite well in Florida's hands. Their originally damaged strength has gradually recovered, and they've become the Cairo mercenary band's greatest opponent this year. Perhaps this time, the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band will truly be able to regain control of the Valley of Sunshine in Florida's hand. Emily creased her brow in thought as she tirelessly recounted Florida's information. When Emily had finished, Hanshaw said lowly, he's a strong opponent all right. This person's heart is sinister, and he even dares to attack his benefactor without mercy. This kind of method is completely different from the Church of Light's principles. It looks like I must be careful. Brian, the Valley of Sunshine is different from other places. It's not bound by any country at all, and whoever has the most power here calls the shots. I know that your strength isn't necessarily weaker than Florida's, but Florida has the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band in his hands. 2 fists can't fight 4 hands. As long as you're in glorious Tanai, I don't think he'll dare make a move with the Cairo mercenary band keeping you in check. However, it's best if you don't go out rashly, otherwise he'll find a chance to make a move. Emily was obviously very wary of Florida as she comforted Hanshaw. Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. Hanshaw's expression was calm as he responded lowly. He paused and said to Emily, right, it's been so long, why hasn't Elaine brought Belinda over yet? I've left a drop of blood essence on Belinda, so she won't be able to cause trouble at all. Did something happen along the way? Emily shook her head with a wry smile when she heard Hanshaw's words. She responded, I'm also worried. Logically speaking, Elaine should have arrived in Tanai by now. Did something really happen? Forget it, I'll leave for a bit and search along the way. Hanshaw said after thinking for a bit. No, you've offended Florida. It's best if you don't leave the Valley of Sunshine for now. That person has great power in this area and won't let you off if he knows that you've left the Valley of Sunshine. Emily's expression grew panicked as she stopped Hanshaw. Nothing will happen. It's not like you don't know my senses. I'll immediately leave once I detect danger. In addition, I've planted a drop of blood essence in Belinda's body. Only I can sense her location within a certain distance. I must make this trip in order to achieve a perfect result for this mission." Han Shoror smiled light-heartedly and didn't take Florida's threat to heart at all as he spoke with great ease. "Since you're so insistent, then I'll go with you," Emily said resolutely to Han Shoror when she saw that she couldn't convince Han Shoror. Shaking his head, Han Shoror declined Emily's suggestion and turned to walk outside. With his back to Emily, he said lowly, "Emily, you should believe in me and not treat me like a child, planning everything for me. This isn't the life I want. If Florida really does make a move, I'll actually look forward to it." Emily had already set off, but she finally sighed when she heard Han Shoror's words. "All right, but you have to be careful. Elaine and Belinda's lives aren't as important to me as you are. You have to remember to protect yourself first." "I will," Han Shoror said. The sky had already gradually darkened when he walked out of the shop. Most of the shops in the Valley of Sunshine had already closed their doors at this time, replaced by the bright neon lights of entertainment. Han Shoror turned a blind eye to the crude and vulgar cries around him as he strode towards the fences leading into the valley. Some procedures were needed to enter the Valley of Sunshine, but nothing was needed to leave. No one questioned Han Shoror when he left, but the Cairo mercenary band knight who had come last time looked at Han Shoror with some surprise. He seemed to find it strange that the two beauties beside Han Shoror hadn't left with him. Han Shoror's sensitive senses detected that there were people spying on him when he walked out of the Valley of Sunshine, but he didn't pay too much attention to them. There was no need to think too much. Those spying on him were either the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band or the Cairo mercenary band. It wouldn't be difficult for Han Shoror to shake them off, and he had ample confidence in himself. Han Shoror had been walking slowly when he left the valley, but his speed suddenly increased several times. Under the dark sky, Han Shoror's figure was as swift as a shooting star that occasionally streaked across the sky. He'd already traversed several hundred meters in the span of a few breaths, pulling far away from those spying on him. When the feeling of being spied on disappeared, Han Shoror suddenly soared into the air and flew close to the lush silver treetops, heading straight for the road from Valen City. With a single thought, the mysterious power of the demon infant circulated in a bizarre manner. Waves of mysterious power spread out from the demon infant, like ripples in the water, covering the far distance. The demon infant and the blood essence had a mysterious connection. As long as Han Shoror was within 1,000 meters of him, Han Shoror would be able to immediately sense the appearance of the blood essence. As Han Shoror calmed his mind and focused on using the demon infant to sense the blood essence, a strange feeling suddenly leapt into his mind. Han Shoror suddenly sensed the presence of life, some large and some small. The feeling suddenly disappeared after Han Shoror's heart trembled. Startled, Han Shoror once again calmed his mind and focused, carefully comprehending the feeling that had suddenly surged into his mind. Han Shoror then discovered that the life auras belonged to the insects and small beasts that had fallen into hibernation beside him. Although they were somewhat indistinct, Han Shoror was still shocked by this discovery. The demon infant suddenly moved slightly at this moment, and Han Shoror sensed the location of the blood essence in the next moment. The overjoyed Han Shoror abruptly sped up in the air, flying rapidly in the direction of the blood essence. However, when Han Shoror arrived at his destination, he saw Elaine lying beneath a large tree, covered in blood. Her neck was bent unnaturally, as if someone had forcibly broken it. Her body seemed to have been struck by wind blade magic, as bone-deep wounds tore through her clothes. Her blood mixed with the snow and melted into a pool of blood. It looked like she'd died not long ago. Suddenly, Han Shoror felt a strong sense of danger. Han Shoror was startled and immediately retreated in an attempt to distance himself from Elaine's corpse. Chapter 200. An explosion suddenly sounded from Elaine's corpse. Elaine's body, which had been bleeding profusely, instantly split into pieces of flesh and blood. The violent impact, like a flash flood, shot in all directions in an instant. 2 broken bones and 3 arrows of blood shot straight at Han Shoror's body, carrying with them a terrifying force. In the time it took for sparks to fly off a flint, Hanshaw quickly recited the incantation for the bone shield. A pile of pure white bones formed a square bone shield 1 meter wide and 1.5 meters long, floating in front of Hanshaw. With a few crisp cracks, the white bone shield couldn't withstand the enormous impact and instantly exploded into even more bone fragments. The white bones broke and flew in all directions, like a beautiful ball of fireworks blooming. If it had been anyone else, perhaps they wouldn't have been able to sense the danger from Elaine's corpse and would have been caught off guard by such an attack. However, Hanshaw's keen senses suddenly leaped into his mind. He immediately sensed an inexplicable power lurking in Elaine's corpse, and reacted in time to retreat. Due to the cruel training that Hanshaw had undergone in the true demon realm, the speed at which he condensed and released his mental strength far exceeded that of a normal mage. This was why he was able to chant the white bone shield at a miraculous speed in the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint. Retreating a dozen or so meters, the white bone shield shattered into chunks of broken bone amidst the bright white light. Hanshaw had miraculously avoided this obviously premeditated ambush. Looking at Elaine's corpse again, there was nothing but blood and minced flesh on the ground. A strong smell of blood suddenly spread into the air. Hanshaw suddenly felt the suffocating feeling. Hanshaw, who had been panting, immediately knew that something was wrong. At this moment, Hanshaw didn't have time to think. The magical yuan circulating in his limbs and bones had already started to circulate automatically. The magical yuan flowed through his limbs and bones like a trickle, washing away the parts of his body that had been affected by the smell of blood that Hanshaw had just breathed in. Hanshaw, who had been a bit weak in his limbs, could feel the strength in his body again. A vicious plan, a cunning enemy. As the scene played out in Hanshaw's mind, Hanshaw was certain that the drop of blood he'd sealed in Belinda's neck had been tampered with and transferred to Elaine's body. The enemy had then killed Elaine and used her body as bait to set up 2 traps against him. First was a spell similar to the corpse explosion spell. Poison had been injected into Elaine's body, and the blood had mixed with the poison in the instant that Elaine's body exploded, forming a second wave of attacks. Only those fanatical cultists of the Calamity Church, who viewed human life as nothing more than grass, would be able to come up with such a cruel and vicious plan that used the corpse of a dead person. Belinda must have been rescued. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to awaken from the shackles of a drop of blood essence on her own. With these thoughts in mind, Hanshaw decided to leave immediately. But just as Hanshaw lifted his foot, 2 footsteps of different heights gradually approached him. Judging from the heavy footsteps and the light footsteps, Hanshaw could determine that it was a man and a woman from their weight. His thoughts raced as Hanshaw's mind worked furiously, searching for the most suitable method and the best time to deal with the two. However, the best time to make a move often had to be created by oneself. When Hanshaw looked left and right, he discovered that there wasn't a very good location and that it was difficult to find the perfect time. He couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Hanshaw, who had been standing ramrod straight, suddenly slumped down. When Hanshaw's sharp eyes were covered by his eyelids, Hanshaw's heartbeat and breathing became abnormally steady, as if he was unconscious. The two slowly approached from afar. Belinda wore her black veil as usual, her bright eyes fixed on Hanshaw without blinking. The other person was rather old. His hair and beard were greyish-brown, and his face was densely covered with wrinkles that looked like ravines. He wore a thick grey cotton coat and held a crooked walking stick in his left hand. His greyish-white eyes looked listless. He walked over slowly while sizing up the surroundings. He wasn't just looking at Hanshaw. "Belinda, wait." The old man suddenly spoke when Belinda was 10 meters away from Hanshaw. His voice was hoarse and deep. Belinda, who had been staring fixedly at Hanshaw, immediately stopped when she heard his shout. She turned to look at the old man in confusion and asked, "Lord Edwin, what is it?" The old man of the Calamity Church, called Edwin's originally greyish-white, listless eyes circled the scene once more before finally focusing on Hanshaw. He said in a hoarse voice, "There's no blood on his body and no signs of injury. He likely didn't suffer any injuries from the explosion of that woman's corpse. Judging from the distance, he may have been drugged and fainted, but we still need to be a bit more cautious. Then what do you think we should do? Belinda didn't continue to approach Hanshaw after hearing his words and even took a few steps back, finally standing shoulder to shoulder with Edwin. Shoot an arrow at his body. With the strength of my potion, he won't feel anything at all if he's really been drugged and fainted, Edwin said. Hanshaw cursed inwardly and thought to himself that this old fart was indeed sinister and ruthless to think of such a malicious plan. This person gave Hanshaw a strong sense of danger, but Hanshaw understood from the condition of his body that he wasn't an expert swordsman or knight. He must be an expert mage with a weak body, but with a wondrous technique. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been so afraid to approach Hanshaw. Belinda laughed lightly and readily agreed when she heard Edwin's instructions. She'd already taken out a bow and arrow and aimed it crookedly at Hanshaw from afar. It was obvious that Belinda wasn't an expert marksman. Her hands weren't steady at all, and even when she aimed at Hanshaw, the bow trembled. Because they were so close, Hanshaw could still feel Belinda's bow and arrow even with his eyes closed. Her arms made light sounds when they came into contact with her armpits. This made Hanshaw's heart flutter, and he quickly considered whether or not he should take the gamble. If Hanshaw suddenly attacked now, Hanshaw didn't have any confidence that he could kill the two of them due to the distance and the fact that the two of them were already on their guard. Not to mention that Hanshaw had no idea what methods Edwin had. It wasn't wise to take such a risk. When Belinda narked an arrow, Hanshaw hardened his heart in the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint. He prepared himself to receive the arrow with his strong body. From Belinda and Edwin's conversation, Hanshaw understood that they didn't want to kill him immediately. It seemed that they had other plans for him. It was from this point that Hanshaw made up his mind. Do it. Edwin's voice was low as he urged Belinda. All right, Belinda replied. Then, she drew her bow and shot out an arrow with a whoosh. As Hanshaw was on tenterhooks, the arrow landed on the snow on his left arm and didn't even touch his body. It looked like Belinda's archery skills were abnormally bad. She hadn't hit her target at such a close distance. It doesn't matter, we have a lot of time. You'll get the hang of it if you shoot a few more arrows. There was no emotion in Edwin's voice as he spoke slowly. His eyes suddenly lit up as he spoke and focused on Hanshaw's body, as if he wanted to glean some clues from Hanshaw's body. All right, I'll try a few more times. Belinda responded and shot out another 3 arrows. All 3 arrows missed their mark and none landed on Hanshaw's body. Belinda was a bit annoyed as she snorted lightly and took out another arrow. She didn't take much aim this time and shot it directly at Hanshaw. However, the arrow was miraculously accurate even though she hadn't taken any aim at all. It flew straight for Hanshaw's calf. The arrow stabbed into Hanshaw's left calf with a thud. Bright red blood slowly seeped out along his trouser leg. This level of physical pain was no longer a challenge to Hanshaw. His heartbeat and breathing hadn't changed in the slightest as he'd endured the attack from start to finish. His expression was even more wooden, as if he'd truly sunk into a deep, unconscious state. There shouldn't be any problems now. Edwin nodded after a careful look and said lowly. Belinda and Edwin then let go of their guard against Hanshaw and moved closer to Hanshaw. Hanshaw calmed himself and focused his attention, prepared to explode and kill at any moment. He only needed to wait for the old man called Edwin to come close before making a move to kill him first. Although Belinda was also quite frightening, her golem was only a great threat in a group battle. Hanshaw didn't fear her at all in a place like this. Just as Hanshaw was preparing in secret, a few strange noises suddenly sounded from afar. The sounds were getting closer and closer. Hanshaw was inwardly surprised as he lay on the ground, feigning unconsciousness. He didn't know who else was coming. "Chief, that person is here." A loud shout suddenly sounded from afar as a group of more than 10 people quickly approached amidst the howling cold winds. "He dares leave the Valley of Sunshine, he must be tired of living." Florida's voice suddenly sounded in Hanshaw's ears, completely out of Hanshaw's expectations. Chief Florida of the Rainbow Sickle Mercenary Band. Belinda suddenly cried out in surprise, appearing quite shocked. "I don't care who you two are, hand that kid over to me immediately," Florida said as arrogantly as ever when he arrived. The eyes of the Calamity Church member called Edwin had regained their calm as he glanced at Florida's group. He first cackled strangely and then said in a raspy voice full of hatred, "So you're Florida. It looks like I was right to come to the Valley of Sunshine this time." An enormous magical ripple suddenly emanated from Edwin's body as he spoke. The aura of dark magic suddenly spread into the surroundings, and 3 huge black palms appeared out of thin air in the direction of Florida and the others, pressing down on them with a ferocious force that seemed to be able to split the heavens and earth. All the trees and rocks in the area exploded in that moment. The towering trees first creaked and then collapsed as if they couldn't withstand the enormous force. The enormous dark magic hand of death was released, and 3 10-meter wide hands of death actually appeared. As the terrifying force came crashing down, 4 mercenaries from the Rainbow Sickle mercenary group couldn't dodge in time and were directly crushed into 4 pieces of bloody meat paste. "Didn't your grandfather Ferguson teach you that you should maintain the respect of an elderly person?" Edwin's voice was full of cruel laughter as he spoke to Florida. Edwin and Belinda of the Calamity Church were already leaning towards Hanshaw at this moment. If Hanshaw wanted to, he could suddenly make a move and harm Edwin right now. However, from the violent movements, Hanshaw could tell that Edwin seemed to hate Florida even more. He'd attacked and killed as soon as they'd met. His strength was much stronger than Emily's when she also trained in dark magic. On one side was the murderous star of the Calamity Church, and on the other side was the enemy of the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band. These 2 groups were both targets that Hanshaw needed to deal with. Their sudden fighting would only benefit Hanshaw and not harm him at all. Rather than making a move now, he might as well continue to pretend to be unconscious and watch them fight each other. "Just who are you?" Florida and the remaining experts of the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band hastily hid even further away before looking at Edwin in shock and exclaiming in shock, "Heh, you may not know me well, but I've been in contact with your grandfather for many years. Perhaps you've heard of the name Edwin." Edwin's voice was still as lukewarm as before as it faintly sounded out. "Calamity Church's Dark Grand Magus Edwin, so it's you old undying monster." Florida started and then swept his gaze over Hanshaw's body. He waved his hands and said, "Retreat." The experts of the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band obeyed Florida's words and swiftly retreated after his words. It was obvious that they were quite wary of Edwin. "You want to run? It won't be that easy." Edwin's voice sounded out once again. He quickly chanted a mysterious magic incantation, and 2 huge death god scythes appeared on his left and right sides. The gloomy and cold death god scythes were even larger than Death's hands. The sharp blades danced in the air, slicing through the towering trees along the way like tofu. Only when the death scythes passed through did they suddenly shatter into pieces on the ground. The aura of death emanated from the giant scythe towards Florida and the others. The 2 tall and strong senior swordsmen on Florida's left and right had no way to resist. They were sliced into a few pieces of meat by the death god's scythe and scattered into bloody chunks on the ground. The terrifying effects of the spell made Florida's party evade even faster. The sudden appearance of such a malefic star had obviously disrupted Florida's plans. Even Hanshaw was startled. The ghastly screams were announcing the loss of life. "Tie him up first, I'll go take care of these people," Edwin said to Belinda when he saw that Florida was running for his life in the direction of the Valley of Sunshine. He then took out a bottle of medicinal powder and handed it to Belinda. "Rub this down his throat. He'll answer anything you ask him when he wakes up. Don't worry, I'll make him pay." Belinda took the bottle and responded firmly. Nodding, Edwin turned around and planned to leave this place to chase after Florida. At this moment, Hanshaw suddenly made his move. The Demon Slayer edge whistled through the air as Hanshaw furiously circulated his magical yuan, stabbing straight for Edwin's back. Hanshaw had originally planned on waiting a bit longer, but now that he'd witnessed Edwin's strength and discovered that the other was about to leave his attack range, he didn't want to continue watching. He chose to use this last opportunity to finish him off first without hesitation. Edwin was stronger than Han Shoror had imagined. The Demon Slayer Edge was moving at such a fast speed at such a short distance. An instinctive reaction suddenly burst forth just as the Demon Slayer Edge was about to stab into his back. A magic shield flashed like black iron and quickly shielded the part of his back where the Demon Slayer Edge was stabbing at. Blood sprayed out with a splurt. The Demon Slayer Edge pierced through the magic shield that was as thick as black iron and stabbed a few inches into Edwin's back. It was then stopped by an enormous resistance and couldn't go any further. At the same time, Han Shoror, who'd been lying motionless on the ground, leapt up like a cheetah and flew past Belinda at lightning speed towards Edwin. Purple light burst forth from his left hand as his palm formed a bayonet and mercilessly slashed at Edwin's neck. Chapter 201. With a muffled groan, Dark Grand Magus Edwin's body swayed as he flew into the air like a willow catkin. Han Shoror's knife-like palm cut through the air, emitting soft hissing sounds. The Demon Slayer Edge embedded in Edwin's back was pulled by an enormous force and abruptly left his body, falling to the ground in the distance. Blood dripping from Edwin's back, Edwin's expression was savage as he chanted a spell. Another hand of death appeared out of thin air and pressed down on Han Shoror's head like a mountain. An enormous aura enveloped Han Shoror's body, almost making it hard for Han Shoror to breathe. With a thought, the Demon Slayer Edge that had already flown into the distance turned into a streak of light and shot towards Han Shoror's direction. Han Shoror suddenly deployed the art of the demonic ninth heavens. When the hand of death pressed down on his head, Han Shoror pierced through the enormous aura enveloping his body like a sharp arrow and shot towards the direction that Florida and the others had fled in. Edwin had already increased the distance between Han Shoror and Edwin when his second attack missed. The speed at which Edwin had shot into the sky just now was clearly much faster than the Archmage Emily. Han Shoror might have been able to hold his own against Florida with his strength, but as a Dark Grand Magus, Edwin's terrifying strength wasn't something that Han Shoror could handle at the moment. Therefore, he immediately retreated when he saw that the situation wasn't looking good. "Treacherous young man, you must die." Edwin's voice was raspy as he called out from the air. He actually ignored Belinda and shot straight for Han Shoror. He couldn't beat Edwin in a fight, but the high speed and agility of the art of the demonic ninth heavens immediately displayed its advantage in running away. He gradually pulled away from Edwin. Suddenly, a group of 10 or so people appeared in front of him. Florida's long hair floated in the air as several experts of the Rainbow Sickle Mercenary Band dashed through the dense forest like lightning. The Rainbow Sickle Mercenary Band had left the Valley of Sunshine to target Han Shoror. Therefore, they'd only dispatched a few experts. How could he have known that his luck would be so bad, encountering the dark great magical tutor Edwin who had a grudge against Florida's grandfather? That was why he ended up in such a miserable state. Fleeing in the same direction, Han Shoror's speed was obviously faster than Florida's group. Being able to catch up with them halfway was within Han Shoror's expectations. Chuckling coldly, Han Shoror approached from behind and used the agility of the art of the demonic ninth heavens to leisurely hang on Florida and the others. As Han Shoror chanted, bone spear after bone spear shot towards Florida like cold lightning. Damn it! Florida heard the whistling sound of bone spears piercing through the air as he turned his head to see 3 bone spears shooting towards his back. He then saw the sinister expression on Han Shoror's face as he looked at him with a cold smile. He couldn't help but curse out loud. A ball of blinding light emanated from the staff in Florida's hand as the radiant sword slash appeared and shattered the 3 bone spears. But at this moment, the difference between the levitation spell and Han Shoror's art of the demonic ninth heavens became apparent. Han Shoror's speed wasn't affected in the slightest after chanting the same spell, but Florida's originally fast flying speed was reduced by a third. Han Shoror understood that Edwin was rapidly approaching as the strange sound of the wind drew near. A mocking smile played at the corner of his lips as Han Shoror slowed down once again and continued to hang behind Florida like a vengeful spirit. He chanted the bone spear spell again and sent out another 3 bone spears. Florida wasn't afraid of Han Shore, but he was extremely afraid of Edwin. If Edwin hadn't been chasing after him, Florida would have stopped without hesitation and fought Han Shore with the force of a thunderbolt. However, he obviously didn't want to be caught up to by Edwin because of Han Shore. Therefore, he could only continue to defend helplessly as his flying speed decreased again and again. "Chief, we'll help you hold him off. You should leave first." At this moment, one of the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band experts in front of Florida yelled out loudly and suddenly stopped where they were. They'd all witnessed Edwin's strength just now. If they stayed behind, they might be able to hold off Han Shore, but they would be hard-pressed to escape Edwin's murderous hands. It looked like they'd already made up their minds to die when they said these words at this moment. "All right, I'll avenge you." Florida was indeed a vicious and merciless character. Although he couldn't bear to do so, he still decisively agreed to the others' suggestions. He glared viciously at Han Shore and continued to walk forward without stopping. 2 crossbows suddenly took aim at Han Shore. The 2 mercenaries' gazes were so sharp that Han Shore felt a bone-piercing sense of danger. 2 whooshing sounds rang out as the 2 crossbow bolts shot towards Han Shore with terrifying speed and accuracy that surpassed Han Shore's imagination. Han Shore, who'd been rushing forward, abruptly retreated, not daring to take another step forward. The divine archers narked their arrows in this process and aimed them at Han Shore. There was a clear difference compared to Belinda's archery just now. Even though Han Shore was already in the air, he couldn't escape the threat below him and had no choice but to retreat once again. However, Edwin's figure was already approaching from the distance at this moment. It looked like he'd be here before long. Han Shore hesitated for a moment and decided to immediately change directions. It was at this moment that the Rainbow Sickle mercenaries below him suddenly began to panic. A ball of dazzling, milky white sword light exploded out from the middle of them. Trunks, riding on his manticore, swung his sword with a callous expression, forcing the Rainbow Sickle mercenaries to no longer have the energy to deal with Han Shore. Trunks. Han Shore was flabbergasted when he saw the abnormalities below him. He couldn't help but cry out in joy as he dived down. "Continue to chase after Florida through the air. I'll be in charge of intercepting these traitors below who deserve to die 1,000 times over. We'll continue our discussion when we return to the Valley of Sunshine." The extraordinarily handsome Trunks raised his head and flashed a radiant smile at Han Shore. He continued to attack the Rainbow Sickle mercenaries on his manticore. "Trunks, don't go too far." The Rainbow Sickle mercenary who'd spoken earlier suddenly glared angrily at Trunks. "You're going too far. Haha, the old chief was so good to you, but you followed behind that animal Florida without a single question after he took power. You still have the face to say these words to me." Trunks laughed heartily as if he'd heard a funny joke. However, his smile was even colder than the icy night wind, and his tone was filled with bone-deep hatred. Edwin's figure grew closer and closer. Trunks snorted coldly and raised his head to look at Han Shore again. He urged, "Brian, hurry up and leave this place. It's best if you can take this opportunity to kill Florida." "All right, that old monster behind us is very troublesome. Get out of the way immediately if he comes over, don't come into direct contact with him." Although Han Shore didn't know why Trunks hated Florida so much, he guessed that it had something to do with the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band. It looked like these Rainbow Sickle mercenaries had known Trunks for a long time. This meant that there was some sort of connection between them. It would be too late if he didn't give chase now. Out of trust in Trunks' strength, Han Shore streaked through the air like lightning and continued in Florida's direction. Not long after Han Shore left, Edwin, who'd been using the levitation spell, also suddenly flew into the air. Edwin only glanced down and didn't linger after discovering that Florida and Han Shore weren't here. He followed Han Shore, looking like he wasn't the slightest bit interested in Trunks and the Rainbow Sickle mercenary band below. Han Shore had already experienced Florida's methods. Han Shore wouldn't be able to live in peace until this person died. With the extreme water in the Valley of Sunshine, Han Shore would need to stay here for a period of time sooner or later. If Florida didn't die then, there would be endless trouble. Therefore, even if he didn't hold a grudge against Phoebe, Han would still kill Florida. Although Han flying technique allowed him to linger for a bit, Han still slowly caught up to Florida when he circulated his magical yuan to the limit. Florida spat out blood in anger when the bone spear whistled again. He now obviously thought that Han wanted to take him down with him and die in Edwin's hands. He was so aggrieved that he really wanted to stop and fight to the death with Han. Just what do you want? None of us will be able to escape when that old monster Edwin catches up. Florida's speed slowed down again after he'd used the radiant sword slash to block Han bone spear. He then roared out in exasperation. Heh, I'm happy to die with you today. Han finally vented all of the pent-up anger he'd been holding back for the past 2 days. He felt a sense of carefree joy in his heart as he roared with laughter. Even if Edwin caught up, Han was confident that he could use his magical yuan to escape. In addition, with Han understanding of an archmage's mental strength, he was certain that Florida wouldn't be able to fly for long, which was why he'd purposefully done this. Madman, you're a fucking madman. Florida finally couldn't help but curse loudly after hearing Han words. Because Florida and Han figures had slowed down at this moment, Edwin's figure had already appeared behind them. His strange cackling also traveled over first. Old dog, hurry up and come over, I'll be waiting for you. Laughing wildly, Han even had the time to glance back at Edwin and provoke him loudly. You better pray that I don't catch you, or I'll make you regret ever being alive. In the distance, Edwin was enraged by the old dog. The wound on his back seemed to hurt even more. The arrow that Belinda had shot into Han calf had long since been pulled out by him. Han strong body had taken effect and stopped the bleeding. Apart from some slight pain, it didn't affect Han movements at all. When the 3 bone spears shot out again and Florida had no choice but to block them, Han took the opportunity to cast dark mist. It was already night time, and the sky wasn't all that bright apart from the crescent moon. When dark mist appeared, the area around Han and Florida was completely enveloped in pitch-black darkness. Damn it! Florida's magic staff exploded with blinding light, but it could only illuminate the area around him. He was a bit flustered in defending against the bone spears, and his flying speed slowed down even more. Kid, I'll take your life first and let your grandfather repay a bit of the debt he owes me. Edwin had finally arrived, and Han was like a wisp of smoke, quickly disappearing in the direction of the Valley of Sunshine. All that was left in front of him was Florida, who had just blocked the 3 bone spears. Han wouldn't be so stupid as to hide his tracks in front of a dark grand magus. Even a truly dead person wouldn't be able to hide when this monster's enormous mental strength covered the area. Therefore, Han could only use his advantage in speed to leave this dangerous area as quickly as possible, leaving Florida to cover his back. When Han figure gradually faded, the effects of the dark mist also disappeared. When Florida saw the bright moonlight once again appear in the chilly night sky, he also saw Edwin, who was seething with rage from Han 7 orifices and was about to make an example out of him. In the name of the God of Light, bind all darkness and shackle all light. Florida's mind was thrown into chaos when he saw Edwin. He didn't even think as he released a light magic, shackle of light. Rings of light the size of hula hoops sparkled with a holy and beautiful light as they rolled under the bright moonlight, surrounding Edwin in the center. Each ring of light was filled with the pure element of light and possessed a powerful binding power. This kid has such high attainments in light magic at such a young age. He will become a great thorn in the side of our Calamity Church in the future. It looks like we can't let you leave here alive today. Dark Grand Magus Edwin was unhurried in the face of the restraints of the light rings. His face that had just been filled with rage at Han actually recovered its calm. Edwin chanted a dark magic spell as he waved his magic staff at the approaching shackles of light. A vast and boundless force seemed to tear through everything as it pulverized the 2 shackles of light that had approached first. Suddenly, the remaining rays of light suddenly strung together. Then, the power of thunder and lightning crackled. Lightning suddenly shot out from each ray of light. The shackle of light that had originally been used to restrain the enemy instantly became a powerful killing move that could destroy everything, sweeping even Edwin into it. Oh, you've got some skill all right. You're able to combine thunder and lightning magic with the shackle of light. A soft exclamation sounded out from Edwin's direction amidst a burst of lightning and blinding light. A dark and glossy magic shield then completely covered Edwin as 3 hands of death appeared out of thin air and grabbed the shackle of light covering his body. They forcefully tore apart the rings of light with ferocious strength. It was as if the bolts of lightning couldn't affect the hands of death at all. Florida spat out a mouthful of fresh blood and then continued to run madly in a panic, as if he didn't want to stay here for even a second longer. This spell, which was a fusion of light and lightning elements, was clearly out of his control. The backlash from the excessive consumption of the spell immediately caused serious damage to his body. However, Edwin had easily broken through such a powerful and miraculous attack. The difference of 1 level was indeed difficult to overcome. Florida knew that he would be hard-pressed to escape death if he stayed a moment longer. Although Edwin had broken through the spell that had consumed all of Florida's strength, it had also taken him a bit of time. When Edwin had used his strength to eliminate all of the residual power of the spell, he discovered that Florida had disappeared once again. Florida's mental strength was greatly exhausted at this time, and his body was on the verge of collapse as he flew. However, the Valley of Sunshine finally appeared in front of him after a long chase. He would be able to enter the Valley of Sunshine with just a bit more effort. No matter how much the Cairo Mercenary Band and Florida schemed against each other, the Cairo Mercenary Band had to abide by the iron rules of the Valley of Sunshine. Therefore, once Florida entered the Valley of Sunshine, anyone who dared to go on a killing spree in Tarnai's territory would be attacked by all factions. Add to that the fact that most of the Rainbow Sickle Mercenary Band was in the Valley of Sunshine. Even Edwin wouldn't be able to do anything to Florida once he entered the Valley of Sunshine. Just as he saw the fences of the Valley of Sunshine, Han Shor's figure also appeared in his line of sight with a cruel smile on his face. He just happened to block Florida's path, obviously not planning on letting him in alive. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.